you had some qualms about our study design.
Yeah, at that point you did not have another condition to compare against, right?
So let me ask you a provocative question.
Sure.
How long does it take LDL concentration levels to affect plaque?
And I will give you a controversial answer. I have no idea. I'm just going to tell you straight up. I don't know.
That was like 20 years. That was 2 decades ago. Why have they not done any more of these stratification analyses? And in a very rare moment, he said, well, they're not really in the business of shrinking their demographic, right? My hope is this podcast, I can get a lot of people who disagree with me here so that we can just have a good conversation.
I genuinely hope that turns out to be the case. I think some people are incredibly amenable to it. It needs to become a norm.
Okay, tell me who you are and what you do.
My name's Nicholas Verhoeven. I just graduated with my PhD in molecular medicine, and I run Physionic, which is my passion project, my career so far. Hopefully it continues. And in general, I chase knowledge, trying to understand how our body works.
When did you know? I'm really curious about this because obviously my colleague Nick Norwitz is going all in on a lot of content creation. I'm sure you agree with me. He's kind of killing it. And
Oh, yeah.
He's rolling. But at what point, because I'm going to be asking a lot of folks in your position, in his position, at what point did it become clear to you that this is a really viable career move to actually move not just from a more, I guess you could say, traditional scientific pathway, but to actually one of making videos where you're doing science communication?
I think it hit me 2 years ago when Physionic actually blew up, because for 8 years I was releasing a piece of content every week. I didn't miss a single week, and I was at 20,000 subscribers, and I was making no money. And then suddenly the algorithm picked things up, and it blew up over the next year and a half, something along those lines. And then I started seeing, the AdSense revenue I was making from that was enough to at least barely make it by. But then I was thinking, okay, well, could I make a business out of this that was ethical, that I wasn't beholden to any sort of company or whatever it might be. And once I started playing around with that formula and trying different things, that's when it really sank in. Okay, I can subsist. I can live off of this, and make a path that is exactly what I want to be doing, which is reading research and translating it for the public, analyzing research and translating it for the public. So, yeah, just in the last year and a half, 2 years.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So you just completed your PhD.
I did about 6-7 months ago.
And so you knew as you were coming up to that finish line, this is right where you were going to jump into.
Mm-hmm.
How's it feel?
I can't express it. I'm blown away that I get to do literally exactly what I want to be doing. It's just an unbelievable feeling.
Can I ask how do you have a video editor, right?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. And that's like contract work, or
Contract work, right?
You think at some point you'll probably have somebody you literally hire full time?
Maybe. I'm trying to keep things as lean as possible, because it's not like, again, because I'm rejecting basically every sponsorship. I've rejected thousands of sponsorships at this point, mainly because I've got my eye on this idea of, again, just building the business to be kind of self-sustaining. So at this point, I'm not making enough money to be able to hire anyone at this point. So it's a possibility in the future, but as it stands, I'm keeping things as lean as possible.
And this is something you and I have in common. I'm not jumping to the conclusion that everybody who has a sponsor is horribly compromised to the point of, but it's kind of I don't know, it's a personal component for me for example, at least for now, this podcast will only have one sponsor, and it's us. It's Own Your Labs, right? Mm-hmm. And then that's it. And same thing. I'm pretty sure if it gets popular, we'll see. It could be that not only do we get approached by a lot of sponsorships, but it could be that we're in a tough spot where, wow, this really could be somebody where we could hire a full-time editor and social media manager and that kind of thing. But I don't know. I do kind of like that, not only that level of freedom, but just that kind of autonomy to not feel any kind of pressure to kind of sway even a little bit in one direction or the other. Because I think you'll probably agree with me. A lot of biases are not overt. They're not something where somebody's waking up each day and they're going, I got to make sure that I
Yeah.
keep all the people who have my, back financially, keep them happy intentionally. Some degree of it is just kind of a little bit of a sway of the winds, potentially, and that we don't always know. We don't always know if there's some motivated reasoning behind it. Again, this isn't to disqualify all that great content that's out there that does have sponsorship behind it.
I agree.
But it's trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
There's some degree in which, if you're turning away all of this potential money, you're paying a fee to have that autonomy.
Yeah, you are. I look at it, I take it one step further in thinking, I try to put myself in the position of the viewer or the listener, and I try to just eliminate any potential that they might even believe that I'm biased because of some outside influence like a sponsorship. So it's not even just having a sponsorship that you might be biased and whatnot, but I'm just trying to eliminate any potential that a person might perceive it that way. But to your point, just because from my view, my personal view, just because you have a sponsorship doesn't mean that you are necessarily biased. I will say though, like when people have, let's say, a name, like different brands and whatnot, they'll say I'm keto this or I'm vegan this or whatever it might be. I do think that you're immediately pigeonholing yourself into this position where you're bracketing what you can discuss and how you discuss it. And I think that's a dangerous territory to get in because that immediately essentially emanates a strong likelihood for bias. And that I tried to steer away from. I mean, that's why I called it physionic, because physiology is just, it's physiology. I mean,
Right.
it's not, it's not vegan. It's not anything. It's just what it is. So that's one thing that I've definitely tried to steer clear of.
Yeah, I fun fact that I don't know that I've even shared in public before, but it's just a factoid, I guess you could say. My original Twitter handle was Dave Keto.
Oh, okay.
The reason it was Dave Keto was I had actually had a couple other Twitter names, and they also just had a Dave in whatever the subject was as the second word, right? So I was like, well, I don't want my algorithm messed up with this whole keto side, so I'm just going to make a different username for that. Well, of course, I had no idea that this research would become as big as it did. And now Dave Keto had like tens of thousands of followers. And frankly, I didn't like that because by the same token, I didn't want to come off as though I'm just strictly a keto advocate. It was literally an indexing.
Yeah.
Typical computer programmer. I just want to, have this alias. And then somebody told me that I could change my alias, but the downside is you might lose a number of followers or so forth. And I was like, I don't care. I'm changing. I immediately changed it to Real Dave Feldman.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I felt a little self-conscious about that because, of course, there are other Dave Feldmans, but in my defense, I was the Dave Feldman on Twitter at that time, and I think maybe still, who had the most followers. So I was like, I'll do that because I found out I could do the same thing on Instagram. So then I just went across the board, changed it everywhere. But to your point, I don't, and I still don't. I'll just say it right now, even though obviously a lot of people who are keto and are low carb are following my work and they're, of course, very interested in it. And I am myself bouncing between keto and low carb. I don't think there's any diet that's the standalone best diet there ever was, right? We were talking about this backstage for a second. I think there's broad directions you can kind of talk about. Whole foods probably better than processed food, but even then, that's a bit of an oversimplified heuristic. And like eating windows, some are better than others. again, a bit simplistic. But if anything, I'm probably just not interesting to follow when it comes to nutrition because I'm already such a skeptic on how many things that are the latest hotness right now. And I'm also a dose makes the poison kind of person. So let's jump into a hot topic: seed oils,
Oh,
right? Okay. I I have ranch dressing, which is, if I'm out and about, I'm sure it's canola and soy and so forth, and I don't think twice about it. Now, to be fair, if I had a diet where that was like a major source of my energy, my fuel, is that I was having shakes of canola oil, that might be a problem. Does it mean that it's inherently specific to canola oil? I mean, the thing is, ancestrally, we didn't have that much refined oils in our diet of the particular type. So it's hard to say. But again, that's because I'm already coming from a place of skepticism in the first place.
sure. Yeah. Yeah, seed oils is a hot topic. You said it, especially the last year or two. Good
I
gracious.
tried to get a debate at COSI on seed oils, and I couldn't.
One of the debaters that was supposed to, he told me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
actually, I was trying to see if you'd be interested, right? Because I think you were going in. Were you going into that topic, or was it somebody else who was going into it?
Yeah, I've been, well, yes, I have been reading into it. I'm not even close to finishing reading into all the studies and whatnot because I tend to be really, I constrain myself in how I investigate different topics. So for me, it's a particular intervention, seed oil, outcome. What's the outcome? So we can't say are seed oils good, are seed oils bad. We have to say are seed oils inflammatory, for example. And that was the outcome that I looked into, and that's what I've been looking into. But then I would have to look into, the next seed oil, whatever it might. Let's say canola oil. Is it cardiovascular disease risk? Like I try to break them apart, and there's going to be a little bit of overlap between them because inflammation is related to cardiovascular disease, et cetera, et cetera. But so yes, I've been looking into it, but I think that the amount of literature that's out there that I would need to look into many of these different outcomes is going to take me a long time.
Yeah, and let's go and jump into it since you opened it. I already don't like anything that's consumed or done as being specifically that being the cause of inflammation. We chatted about this before on your podcast. Uh, Inflammation is the body's natural response, by the way, something we would die without, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's what people usually mean when they are thinking of inflammation being bad, or even if they don't know it is chronic inflammation. If you are perpetually inflamed, that's a problem. That's definitely a problem and not something that's supposed to be happening, at least with regard to something that you're doing that's preventing a state after inflammation where you should be more anti-inflammatory, right? So if I say a particular food is inflammatory, I'm already wondering. Now wait a sec. Is that because it's injurious? Like it's hurting something and then there's an inflammatory response to it? Because very few things actually are, at least in the way that we're thinking of it, actually are truly independently pro-inflammatory. It's whether or not they have some injurious stimuli, something that they're causing that's the intermediary that causes the inflammatory response. So, for example, something could be a bad food, and in time, there is a detectable inflammatory response. That's why these short term studies don't impress me at all. If it's like, oh, we didn't see a rise in CRP, in our 2 week trial, I'm like, okay, well, that's just not interesting to me at all. It could
yeah.
be completely inflammatory. It just needed time to create that injury that would then have an inflammatory response that's detectable.
Yeah, that's true. I I would definitely concede that point. I think once you start looking at the totality of the literature, so you don't focus on, and this is definitely something that applies to all science. I really think that we should be looking at mechanistic research. We should be looking at clinical research. We should be looking at epidemiology. We should be looking at genetic studies, and then grouping all that together to come to some sort of understanding. we don't have we don't have those studies for every single topic, right? So sometimes we have to make some assumptions one way or another, or we take a stab in the dark and then we contextualize how we talk about it, which you do a phenomenal job of. And I mean, it's one of the main reasons why I just love discussing things with you, because you are really careful about how you discuss things. You're nuanced, which is just unbelievably important, especially in today's day and age. And one exciting thing about COSI is because it is trying to bridge that gap. But that's another topic, so we can talk about that later. But yeah, so the long-term effects, like inflammatory foods or whatever it might be. But then when you look at like mechanistic research, sometimes you can find certain molecules or certain primary components of a food that do cause like a significant inflammatory response. But you can't just look at that. You have to look at some of the, to your point, the long-term data as well to see, okay, well, do we actually see that in some of the clinical metrics? Do we see that track over time with people over 10 years, 20 years, things of that nature? So it's just so much nuance to try to figure out if something is quote unquote good or bad. And my method is to start with, do we see clinical negative outcomes? Do we see cardiovascular disease events, for example, or death, or something along those lines that tracks with this food? And then you start backtracking, through these different layers of epidemiology, RCTs, mechanism research, and then you start to piece all of that together to come to a conclusion. What I think a lot of people do is they focus on the mechanisms first. They point out one negative thing. They see, it's extremely inflammatory, whatever it might be. And then they try to find different ways of creating a story, a narrative around that, when the outcome data doesn't support it at all. And that's because they're focusing on only one mechanism, when in truth, there are many mechanisms, hundreds of things that are changing, hundreds of mechanisms that are happening that are, some of them are negative, some of them are positive, but the net effect, and this happens all the time, there's plenty of evidence, for example, when you just eat food, it's a negative effect on some of your physiology. There are markers that are negative, like inflammatory markers that suddenly spike. It's like, okay, well, I mean, what are you going to do? Just not eat food for the rest of your life? I mean, the outcome for that, we know, if you never eat food again.
Right.
So it's just, again, it's just going back to this nuanced approach and really putting most of your focus on the outcomes. That's how I think about it.
I mean, an obvious example is exercise itself, right? Exercise is inflammatory.
Yeah, right.
So you'd better avoid exercise. You're going to inflame the muscles you're targeting, when obviously it's what's the word I'm reaching for? Where a little bit is very good, but a lot is
Hormesis, isn't it?
Yeah, hormetic, right?
Hormetic.
Exactly. So it's a hormetic effect, and to what degree that might be the case with food. For example, spicy food can be inflammatory, right? But to what degree that actually may even be beneficial to the short term or to a certain dose, but too much can be problematic. That's difficult to tease out in research, right? And this is where folks like yourself and Nick Norwitz, you're both kind of heading towards the isolate, get to a particular study, try to review in the larger context. I respect that so much, because I'm more interested in something like this, which is going to be more free-form and conversational. But what you're trying to do is difficult when it's like a new flavor of the week, to the point that you were making, some new mechanism that's discovered, and then people start extrapolating from it. And the engineer in me has a real problem with that, because a lot of times there's this assumed positive feedback loop. And no, I agree exactly with what your sentiment was, which is in biology, oftentimes for anything that you find for which there seems to be a positive feedback loop, there are other negative responders that actually change it from the other direction. Let me actually pick one to open up the geek door a little bit. Lipoprotein lipase, which is very central to the lipid energy model. Lipoprotein lipase is it's a lipase. It's an enzyme that actually lipolyzes lipoproteins. So lipoproteins are carrying around these lipids, and when, to skip it and make it a bit simplified for a lay audience, when in contact with that lipoprotein lipase from a cell through a number of different mechanisms, the lipids can then get ultimately transported into the cell with some spillover, right? Okay. Well, cells make lipoprotein lipase unless they're actually being inhibited from making the lipoprotein lipase. That's interesting. Why wouldn't you just have them make lipoprotein lipase on demand as opposed to have to make the thing that stops the machinery that makes them anyway? But that's all over biology. All over the place, there are these inhibitors to something that does have a positive feedback loop on its own. And a lot of the diseases are related to missing the inhibitor to the thing that keeps that positive feedback loop going. And so it's the normal circumstance that you have these things that block often to those things that would go on their own anyway, right? And that part's important because you might just only have discovered lipoprotein lipase and not yet have discovered ANGPTLs, which are they're all lipoprotein lipase inhibitors. And what's great about discovering ANGPTLs is that they're extremely mechanistic and cross-tissue communicating. So that, for example, the liver can be like, oh, hey, actually it's time for muscle oxidation to occur. We're in a state in which I can ANGPTL3-8 complex. Am I remembering that correctly? I think it is. ANG3-8 and their complexes help to induce a greater lipoprotein lipase activity at muscle tissue, for example, right? And again, and you can also find inhibitors to the inhibitors, right? It's all super fascinating, but by the same token, it's the cautionary tale as to why we shouldn't, the first time we discover these little mechanisms, that we can suddenly start drawing between two dots, go, these are the two dots that matter the most, and now my grander theory on the the whole unraveling of biology is complete. And now I want to tell you about it, and now I want to, sell you this product that has to do with one of these two dots.
Oh, yeah.
But that's pretty commonplace, right? In the field of nutrition.
All the time, yeah. And I honestly don't understand it. I don't understand why we have such a backwards way of thinking about it. Maybe some of it is, kind of sort of to your point that people maybe just aren't aware that there are all these inhibitors and then inhibitor to the inhibitor and all these different other mechanisms that are involved in the one mechanism that's being talked about. And it just leads people to make faulty conclusions off that.
Yeah. So we had on your channel, we had a podcast that was 2.5 hours, 3 hours long, something like that.
Something like that.
Which, by the way, I recommend. So your channel's Physionic. Somebody could, if they're watching this right now, they can pause, they can go. They got to have a lot of time to spare.
Oh, yeah.
And we get really geeky. I have to kind of set this up a little bit. For that podcast, you invited me to just be uninhibited and just geek out. And I actually kind of surprised myself with, it was just like my whole thesis was just spilling out of my mouth. But I re-listened to it recently at 2 times speed, and I was like, wow, I just didn't stop. It was like therapy. It's like you were the biochemistry, psychiatrist going, tell me about your, your thoughts. And I just kept, but it was so cathartic for me. And I have to thank you for the experience. But for an extra humorous context, that actually was after you had interviewed Nick Norwitz with me on the channel at the same time for about 45 minutes, where we knew that was going to be the first phase and this was the second phase. But I took a few notes for the things that we didn't cover, but wanted to cover so that we could carry it over to this podcast. So if you're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because we finished that podcast and then we knew we had covered like 40% of what we actually wanted to cover. There was so much more.
So one of them was, for sure, we were going to be talking about my study, the lean mass hyperresponder study, which Lundquist calls the Keto CTA study. At the time that we were chatting, I don't think we had the match analysis
No.
published, but it had been announced by Dr. Budoff. So you're already familiar with this match analysis. And it was the original study as we had it is 100 lean mass hyperresponders and near lean mass hyperresponders. I'll put it that way. The core eligibility is an LDL cholesterol of 190 or higher, HDL cholesterol of 80 or higher, triglycerides of 80 or lower. And they needed to be at those levels due to a hyperresponse that they had to prove to us. So they had to show us blood work before they showed us those numbers that proved their LDL had risen by at least 50% or more, and that whatever that prior number was, it was under 160. So for sure, they were at a much lower LDL before having gone on a ketogenic diet. And they needed to have been on the ketogenic diet for about 2 years. Now, there's a host of other cardiovascular disease related risk factors that also needed to be excluded. So, for example, if they had a prior diagnosis of cardiovascular disease already, if they had a prior diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, if they were hypertensive, other things related to metabolic syndrome, those also were exclusion criteria. Now, when we started the study, the total number needed to be 100, so we were recruiting 100. They would get a scan at the Lundquist Institute. We flew them out there. They needed to rest overnight, get a scan in the morning along with some comprehensive blood work, and the scan is a CT angiogram, which is a high-resolution heart scan. It's fantastic, and frankly, I think I'm more bullish on it than I've ever been in my life. And then 1 year later, they would get a second scan. So this is known as longitudinal data because we'll have the first scan and the second scan for all participants about a year apart. And then at the end, and that's the data that's under submission right now, we will actually have a population level comparison to see how much there has been progression of plaque at a population level with our participants. And of special interest is non-calcified plaque. Now, I'm not sure how recently you reviewed it because it probably was more top of mind when we were doing the first podcast.
Definitely.
But my guess is you still remember you had some qualms about our study design.
Yeah, at that point, you did not have another condition to compare against, right? Because that ended up coming after with the keto trial. Is that right?
Correct. So to set the table a little bit more. So that's our study. In the course of our study happening, another study was completed out of Miami Heart. Miami Heart is this other study. Principal investigator is Dr. Kram Nasir. They have around 2,400, 2,500 participants. So it's a fairly sizable pool. It's just cross-sectional, which is to say not longitudinal. They only got one scan at baseline, and then they're following up for future events. But that cross-sectional data was super valuable to us because since Dr. Budoff had access to both, with some working out between the teams, we were able to do a match analysis. And this is the data that I think we'll be talking about in a moment. The match analysis is what Budoff, I want to say it's a year and 3 months ago. That's the data that we were potentially going to be discussing. In the Miami Heart Group, they had age minimum and age maximum. And of our 100 participants, there were 80 that were within their age minimum and maximum. So we took that 80, and then the statistician from Lundquist was able to make what's known as a match control group, which is to say, inside the 2,400, 2,500, could there be a pulling out through, I forget what it's called, but it's basically a random allocation, but still matching the group averages of the 80 that we had on our side. And it was actually an extremely close match, this matched control group. So basically, they're perfectly matched for age, ethnicity, gender, and then very, very closely matched with risk factors such as C-reactive protein, hypertension, or I should say not hypertension, but systolic and diastolic blood pressure, A1C, and so forth. And then from that, we could then look at what their average LDL cholesterol was, which their average was 123. The average of our cohort was 272, so more than double. Ours had been, in those 80, an average of 4.7 years on the ketogenic diet. And so then our baseline, before we had the longitudinal data, so the first set of scans, our baseline first set of scans could be compared in our 80 versus their 80. And the match analysis showed there was statistically no difference between these two groups, with actually the keto group trending toward better. But as I always say, right after I say that, doesn't mean they're doing better, because it's still statistically insignificant difference between the two, just trending toward better. And just like I did in the podcast, the only reason I bring that up is if they were trending toward worse, I'd be willing to bet a bunch of people would bring that up, even if there wasn't a statistically significant.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so there's just no question. If I'm somebody who has high LDL, I'm on keto, and I look like this eligibility criteria, emphasis, I look like this I have no other cardiovascular risk factors, I can understand why people would take comfort in these data, even though I'll further caveat, it's just the first tranche of data. We'll have more steps to go. Treat this as preliminary data among everything else you've got, right? So hopefully that set the stage. I think that more of your qualms might have to do with the match analysis, right?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I like the match analysis. I thought it was a great move because it does offer more information on what's going on with LMHR. The biggest thing that I'm curious about is over time, what happens? Does atherosclerosis happen to any degree? Does it happen to a slower degree? Does it happen to a similar degree to another group that may be somewhat similar? And I'm not sure if, and you probably could answer this better than I can, but if 1 year is sufficient time, even with this, you said it's double the LDL
Yeah,
levels? More than double the LDL levels. And I think I mentioned this on the panel that one thing that I would not be surprised if people who have what would be considered healthy BMI or relatively lean individuals have good blood pressure, aren't insulin resistant, but they have elevated LDL, if they just have a much slower progression of plaque. And I just don't think we have that data yet. We don't know if that's the case or not. Slower or potentially no progression. Like, I'm open to that idea too, where there's no accrual of plaque, even with a high LDL, which would be blasphemous to the whole lipid heart hypothesis, right? Because the belief is that once you reach about, I think the number is like 70 milligrams per deciliter, above that, you start to have some progression of atherosclerosis, pretty much regardless of any other conditions. Of course, the other conditions, again, the ones that I mentioned, blood pressure, insulin resistance, weight, all that stuff, play an additional factor, massive factors in certain situations where it can accelerate it tremendously. But even with those adjusted for, controlled for, you would still see atherosclerosis progression, even if it were maybe potentially much slower. So that's probably my biggest critique, and the thing, not even a critique, it's just something that I would like to see moving forward.
Yeah, I said this, I predicted this throughout this entire process. Once I knew the average age of our cohort was 55, I've said this many times over, I'll say it one more time. I think I even said it on the podcast. I expect a population average increase in plaque with our group, no question. Part of why I say that is because that's going to be the case with any 55-year-old cohort. Go ahead and find me any data where there's average 55-year-olds, and at a population level, there's not an increase in plaque. That I'm just, even if there's an aggressive lowering, PCSK9 loss of function, for example, those folks theoretically should all have no cardiovascular disease. They should have no plaque, but they do. They have less cardiovascular disease incidence relative to the rest of us, but they likely have comparably presentation of plaque, maybe not as much, showing that it's, even being at a very low level in a controlled degree is not an indicator that plaque isn't going to occur at all. So this kind of broader progression of plaque once you're at older and old, and there could be an age component to that. There could be the less capability of the endothelial cells themselves, or maybe the immune cells, or both. Who knows, right? But that was already my prediction. Now, the larger question that we get the internal validity for, which is pretty juicy, is how much internally does LDL correlate to plaque, both the presentation of it and the progression of it. Well, we couldn't speak to the progression of it because this is the cross-sectional part. But we could speak to the incidence of it. So how much did, say, the total plaque score correlate to LDL? It didn't correlate at all. It didn't correlate at all in either group in those initial findings, right? So that's like really powerful data, because our cohort had it at very high levels. I could totally understand critics being more dismissive of our data if our lean mass hyperresponders were, say, and near lean mass hyperresponders were, say, 140, 150 LDL, right? But they're 272 LDL. They're in the top 10 of the top 1% of the population. So again, with all of the appropriate caveats, it's early days, right? It met, honestly, with my prediction so far, that once you're getting into a healthy cohort, and particularly in this circumstance that their LDL is high from being fat adapted, that maybe we're not seeing this as the same pathogenic state as would be expected.
You mentioned that you're going to be comparing against the population average at some point.
Well, here's my guess. My guess is if you were to compare the incidence of plaque against the general, I don't know that there is a study that's just total broad surveillance per se, right? Because you're usually recruiting against a.
Yeah.
There's no random. Hey, you! Would you like to jump in our CT angiogram?
Right.
I actually wish there were, though. I wish that there were more things like that.
Yeah.
I guess NHANES is maybe the closest we have, but they're not going through CTAs, right?
No.
But this is a question I have for you, actually. Let's say you were going against the population average, right? Let's say I were to ask it this way. If we were to have population average CTAs, we had the data, where do you think lean mass hyperresponders would rank over time?
And this is population average with no adjustments. Like, you're not doing any sort of adjustment for BMI and all that good stuff.
Let's just say we divide it into quintiles, right? The lowest risk being a 1 and the highest risk being a 5. And you knew nothing else about the population I'm telling you about except for those 3 cut points that are lean mass hyperresponders. They have a super high LDL, 200 or higher, but they also have HDL of 80 or higher and triglycerides of 70 or lower. What number would you assign them for cardiovascular disease risk?
Ooh, that's tough. So my current impression is that LMHR are at lower risk. The bridge that I'm trying to get over is, are they at no risk? Or at least at the same level of risk as a person who's taking care of everything. A person who's all the
equal,
different things.
but their LDL is low.
Right, exactly.
Right. And that's the question.
Yeah, I know. That's why we're here.
Right.
Yeah. And so I guess if it was like quintiles, and let's say the bottom quintile was people who do meet those criteria and they've locked in on everything, I suppose I would put LMHR right above them currently,
Right.
which could change.
But that's already a big change itself.
Yeah.
Like pretend we could go back in time and I could talk to the you of 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I brought you just the description of my cohort. So you didn't know the outcome date. I said, we're studying these people who have an LDL of 272.
Yeah.
They otherwise have low cardiovascular disease risk factors.
Yeah.
What do you suppose being at 272 for 4.7 years would show? Do you think it'll show a pronounced increase in plaque, especially if they already had plaque?
Yeah. I would absolutely. I would have argued a higher,
Like-
they would have been
yeah.
higher up on the quintile for sure, no doubt about it. I probably would have put them in the same camp as like people that have maybe even lower LDL but have like insulin resistance, higher blood pressure, all that stuff. Just because we put LDL and ApoB at such, it's like the premium. It's like number one. The main thing that we should focus on. So many lipidologists say that that's the main thing, if not the only thing that we need to focus on. And yeah, that's an interesting conversation in its own right, just because I was having a conversation at the conference with someone about how I feel like there is a certain level of arrogance on both sides. And definitely not you, just to be clear. But there's a certain level of arrogance on both sides of just this assumption that, okay, on the low carb side, there's like, well, now we have this data, LDL doesn't matter. And we can just dismiss everything that's been put out there. On the other side, I'm annoyed at a lot of lipidologists that I've heard kind of peripherally talk about LMHR or just talk about LDL or ApoB as a whole. And they just reduce it to it's the only thing to worry about. I mean, we've gotten to the point where some people just say that's the only thing to worry about, or it's the major thing to worry about. And I still agree that it is a major thing to worry about, but I just wish that, especially when you're looking at massive population, like a lot of the data is based off of hundreds of thousands of people, and you're trying to make these relationships between LDL and cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular mortality, and things of that nature. So it seems odd to me that why wouldn't we miss a population of people within that, the overall population of people, a sample of people, if you want to put it that way, that may be exempt. I mean, there are many examples of people that have a particular gene profile, or they may have a particular lifestyle or whatever, where they are off the beaten path. They're just not, they don't follow the usual trend. So while people living their normal lives may follow the general population, there can always be exceptions to that. And I find it stunning that people won't engage in that conversation of, oh, there's just no way. There's no way. And that to me is a level of arrogance that I'm very much against, which is why I was so intrigued in just at least having the conversation and having, just more data. Like, what's wrong with more data?
Yeah.
Having more data, right?
Well, that's the other fascinating thing is somebody sent me a clip. I'm gonna be doing a bit more content, and some of my solo content is I'll actually be doing more. I like to call them respectful reaction videos.
I love those.
Right, and it's my genuine attempt to try to steelman things for other people. But somebody sent me a clip from something that I'll listen to fairly soon. So I don't know how much of this was out of context. But in the clip, they were basically saying, and it's going to get worse. They're trying to raise money to do another study.
Oh, the horror.
And I was like, yeah, I'm really, really trying to reinforce my bad opinion with more direct data, right? But it's interesting that the pushback originally was, it doesn't matter what you do with these other risk factors. High LDL / high ApoB means you're at a high risk for cardiovascular disease, hands down. And the sort of new I don't know another way of putting it, but goalpost, I guess you could say, is, well, lean mass hyperresponders are such a small group of people. It's a tiny group of people. And my answer back would be like, or it's physiology. Like it really is. The thing we were talking about a lot in your podcast, which is where kind of my broader challenge comes, is that these things that cluster with the high LDL / high ApoB that are also cardiovascular risk factors are often things that change the LDL and ApoB levels themselves. So, atherogenic dyslipidemia. It is low HDL, high triglycerides, and a higher preponderance of small dense LDL particles. Can I make you have atherogenic dyslipidemia? I argue that I can. You mentioned you had pancakes this morning offline, right? So let's say that I fog-wad you and locked you up in a cell and had you just eating lots of refined carbohydrates with very little protein. I think in time you would develop atherogenic dyslipidemia. I could do this experimentally. I could test your LDL particle count beforehand, how the proportion of small would be low at the beginning, and I'll bet it'd be high at the end. I changed your lipid profile. So if you were to suddenly see this association between your small dense LDL particles and the development of atherosclerosis, I would say, okay, but there's a huge confounder. Your metabolic health got altered. And because your metabolic health got altered, I think that's relevant when looking at these LDL particles, the small LDL particles, or for that matter, ApoB in general, because that is this broader collider, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this is an area where we slightly disagree. And we talked about it on the podcast about statistical adjustments, right? Where there have been studies that have looked at, adjusting for BMI, adjusting for insulin resistance, high triglycerides, all these different factors. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't believe in those adjustments quite as much as what I do.
That's a good way for you to put it. It's here's how I would put it. I don't have as high a confidence in their predictive certainty as you do. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah.
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 So how best could you determine if something has predictive power? You test it, right?
Yeah, but with something that I was saying on the panel too is because of the time scale for some of these things, it's difficult to test, right? It's not like certain things don't have these massive effect sizes where the next day you can just be like, oh, we have an outcome, right? So it takes such a long time for certain things to develop. So
let me ask you a provocative question.
sure.
How long does it take LDL concentration levels to affect plaque?
And I will give you a controversial answer. I have no idea. I'm just going to tell you straight up. I don't know. I don't know the time scale on that because I'm not a lipidologist. Maybe a lipidologist could answer that like to a T. Oh, it takes about this amount of time. But then, of course, we're going back to the context question of a lot of this data has been done in, the general population, typically looking at insulin resistance and high blood pressure and all that stuff, which could speed up the whole process. So, it's just difficult to tease out. I mean, I suppose you could figure out some of this stuff experimentally, like doing like ex vivo experiments, which have been done, where they perfuse LDL. I mentioned that on the panel as well, and they see LDL sticking. But that still doesn't give you a perfect metric of, right. Oh yeah, well it's always going to be this way. No, absolutely not, because there's so many other factors that feed into it and speed it up or slow it down. And the slowing down is the part that I find exciting about LMHR. That is it slow down to equal risk to a person doing everything perfectly, or is it slow down to just above that point? And that's where I am right now.
Well, but that gets back to the comment you were making earlier. You would say ApoB is a major concern. That's what you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
right? So a major concern is something you should be aware of. Okay, let's take sunlight. if I were to say, I think you should be getting 15 minutes more sunlight a day, right? Do you agree with me that that's a major concern?
15 minutes of sunlight.
Yeah.
It doesn't. I mean,
It's not top of mind, right?
Yeah,
It's not something where you're like, that's really in my top 10 list of things that I think people should care about for
yeah, I was
cardiovascular
gonna
disease
say,
risk.
we're gonna get flamed for this, by the way, because some people really,
true.
really believe
That's true.
if you don't get 15 minutes, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, and don't get me wrong, we're not being dismissive of it because
Sure.
probably 15 minutes more of sunlight a day for most people is a net benefit.
Yeah.
I'll bet you would agree with me on
Yeah,
that.
I
Like,
agree.
we know vitamin D levels are historic lows, et cetera, right? But the point is, the risk benefit in us doesn't even hardly register. We're not even hardly thinking about it. But the reason I bring that up is because getting back to ApoB levels changing enough to the degree that we're seeing with lean mass hyperresponders, if they're even a moderate risk, given that exposure, they would graduate to a major risk, right? Theoretically, they should be a very high risk. So let me get it back to the time scale. An easy heuristic for us to kind of go off of are existing randomized control trials.
yeah,
How long are randomized control trials? Are they decades?
definitely not.
Definitely not, right. And I don't have it handy, but I think I looked at the average and it was something like 2.2 years or something to that effect. And they've gotten actually shorter.
I was gonna say, yeah, even 2.2 years for an average is a little surprising to me.
Yeah, it's, what is it, no, not for us, but Jupiter. Jupiter's 1.9 years, right? So given that, I think it'd be fair to say that in order for Jupiter to have such a large impact on the recommendation for having cholesterol-lowering medication, particularly for like primary prevention, baked into that is the assumption that, yeah, 1.9 years is plenty of time for LDL change to have an impact on plaque levels such that you have a change in events, right?
Yep.
Otherwise, we'd have to disregard all studies that
At least from a relative risk standpoint, that we can detect that much of a difference. Then you start getting into absolute risk, which people torch.
we'll
But
put a pin in
anyway.
that
Yeah,
one.
we'll put a pin in that.
But our cohort is 4.7 years, right?
Well, yes, but it's also there's an aspect of that that's retrospective, right? So there's a certain. I mean, again, you're more in the know of this than I am because you were actually involved in the study and know this like the back of your hand. But there is a certain level of trust that's in that as well, right? Because the prospective part was only 1 year.
Correct. Yes. What you're saying is you're entrusting that what people told us is true
Yeah,
with regard to how long
That-
they say they've been on a ketogenic diet.
ketogenic diet, right? And I mean, but you mentioned that you had done blood tests, or they had to prove
They had
the
to
blood
prove to us.
tests
Right.
that there was this increase in LDL. But was the blood, so this is a good question in terms of the study design, was the blood test had to have been done 4 years ago, and then they had to prove that there was an increase?
They had to, what they had to do is turn over their last blood test before starting a keto diet and then their most recent blood test.
Okay.
And to be fair, and sure, it's possible that people weren't being honest. They do have to decree that indeed they'd been on a ketogenic diet, and that was the last blood test that they had before. One of the biggest challenges we had was a lot of people we couldn't recruit because they couldn't find their prior blood test.
Which makes sense. Yeah.
It's a common issue, right? But that was a hard one that we held to. We needed for them to prove to us that they indeed were a hyperresponder. That also meant that it was less likely we would have people who had actual molecular FH, because if they were born with the higher levels, or,
Right.
for that matter, it would have gotten screened and picked up pretty easily just by their standard lipid panel.
Yeah, because if it was FH, it would throw off the study because we're talking about a completely different physiology in that scenario.
Right. But
Okay.
4.7 years, I mean, Heck,
It's a long time.
let's say that it was even less. Let's say it was 3 years, and some people were way off, right?
Okay.
Even if it was 3 years, we're still well above the 2.2 average on randomized control trials. But the bottom line is the randomized control trials are at least stating plainly that an intervention for a far lower margin of LDL drop compared to lean mass hyperresponders, going from an average of 122, because that was the average of their LDL, their mean average as a cohort before their hyperresponse coming up to 272. You can take it in the other direction, whereas the randomized control trials are an intervention to bring it down. Ours was an intervention that resulted in it being up, and up way more than your typical drug brings it down.
Yeah.
So if those randomized control trials had enough of a margin of time that we can say that's enough time for a smaller amount of exposure difference, the change was enough for there to be not only a net result in the plaque, but enough of a net result in the plaque that it would affect events, which of course is the underlying presumption. To state it a different way, I don't know anybody who's saying, oh, LDL has an effect on events but doesn't have an effect on plaque.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So no, it's to such a degree that you actually have changes in occlusion and things like that, such that you would have a change in events. And that's why me as an engineer, I can't help but go, if we get into the math, you'll see why these don't connect. If randomized control trials can be trusted to look at these folks, and then you can apply things like statistical instruments to try to adjust it away and then expect to be looking at a healthy cohort, I would challenge that because ours is the only data I'm aware of sky high LDL in an otherwise healthy population prospectively.
Yeah, I see your point. I think, and also another thing is that with a lot of these studies that do these different statistical adjustments, that none of these studies are actually probing an LMHR specific phenotype, right? It's not like they're looking at exactly that group that has this low triglyceride level, high HDL and high LDL. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I can't rebut anything that you just said. Absolutely. The one thing I will say though, I've been reading a few studies. I actually didn't focus almost any of my attention on the statin literature when I was looking at some of the ApoB research. The main reason for that is because a lot of people in the low carb, not everyone obviously, but a lot of people in the low carb world hear the word statin and they just shut down, and they don't talk. They don't want to have a further conversation, and so I just decided to eliminate that piece of evidence to just focus on the genetic studies, which I know you've discussed as well in the past, looking at the correlate, all the RCTs and whatnot, but recently, I've started looking a little bit more at the statin literature, and I've run across some studies that I found were really interesting because they did address some of the criteria, not for LMHR to be clear, but specifically for, like, let's say leaner individuals with no blood pressure issues or leaner individuals that don't have insulin resistance. The cutoff points for all that is very flexible, obviously, because we're talking like diabetes or no diabetes. There's some room there,
Right.
but what was shown in these studies, and by the way, they were independently funded, is that the statin therapies did still lead to significant, huge effects in preventing cardiovascular mortality, total mortality, cardiovascular events, obviously, in people that had a BMI that was in the LMHR realm. So like 23, 24, I think, something like that, 23, I think, and had lower blood pressure, as in weren't hypertensive and didn't have insulin, or I guess I should say, didn't have type 2 diabetes, to be very specific. And I find that data really interesting because it does speak to this whole idea that just because, and I guess it's kind of a cautionary tale to people who I think hear the LMHR phenotype and then they say, well, I may not be LMHR or I may be close to LMHR, but I have sky high LDL, so it's not a risk factor because I'm lean, I'm taking care of my blood pressure, all this stuff. My point being, I just haven't until now seen RCTs that actually show that in that population, we're not talking about severely insulin resistant people with hypertension and all that stuff. So it's a little bit to the side of your LMHR point. I don't have, any refutation of what you were saying, but just for anybody listening, there are studies that, we can get that difference between LMHR and people that are almost LMHR, but just not quite there. They don't have that profile. And I just caution and I'm worried that those individuals will start to think that they also may not have any risk or be at such a low risk. And that was a bit of a contentious point when it came to the panel when we were discussing it at COSI.
Yeah, well, and this is always a challenge for me because I'll be upfront that I feel a bit more constrained in talking about treatment as opposed. So I often say I don't talk as much about the drugs because they're the cart and the actual lipid hypothesis is the horse.
Yeah.
So what you do about your high LDL is its own question, right? And if there are studies that say, hey, there does seem to be a benefit in primary prevention for folks who are very low risk factor otherwise for taking a statin. My first objection is that the nature of these studies, and I always feel this is always the part where I feel the ice is starting to crack under my feet, right? Because for the same I want this space, I want this podcast to be a place where I can be super authentic.
Yeah.
So I want to get past a lot of these filters that are sort of built in.
Yeah.
But this is just a scientific contention that I think is a very valid one. The challenge with a lot of these studies that use a drug as an intervention scientifically is that drugs do multiple things. There's no drug that does just the one thing that's like a magic wand and all of a sudden there's less LDL. And part of the information I would love to have for a lot of different drugs is what the metabolic health was of the group beforehand and then what it was afterwards on the intervention.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So for example, with statins, apparently, I found this out a while ago from a paper before Wegovy and so forth became the new hotness, is apparently there is some GLP-1 connections with statin. I think it's extremely modest. But immediately my head went to, I would be very curious if it had even just the tiniest bit of, say, weight loss as part of the intervention. Maybe there's just a tiny bit more nausea. Maybe there's a tiny bit, anything along those lines that could modestly affect metabolic health. Not that I think that's absolutely what's going on. That can, of course, be a confounder because going from a place of metabolically challenged to less metabolically challenged can, is from our own research that we published, usually going from a higher BMI to lower, can have a resulting impact on the risk profile, along with also having a lower LDL, right?
Yeah.
So now let's take that back to the 4S analysis that David Diamond likes to cite a lot, which brings in the triad. It's the only time that I've seen, and I think it's 25 years old now, where they stratified between those people who had atherogenic dyslipidemia in particular. They had low HDL and they had high triglycerides, versus the other strata that wasn't actually anywhere close to lean mass hyperresponder, but I think it was like HDL of 40 and higher and triglycerides of 150 or lower,
Okay.
right?
Yeah. So much broader,
Much broader, but still more metabolically healthy, definitely.
relatively. Yeah.
Yeah, relatively, I should say. They had very little benefit from having a statin. Some benefit, according to the analysis that they had.
Did they have high LDL still?
I believe so.
Okay. I haven't looked at the Forest trial. I know it's a famous trial and whatnot, but like I said, I'm just starting to get into the whole statin literature. So,
Yeah, and it was a reanalysis. It was
okay.
you could probably look at the COSI video, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's in that, or at least it's in a lot of his talks.
Okay.
But but I had Ethan Weiss on my channel at one time, and I was pointing out, I find it a little frustrating because I want more of this stratification analysis.
Yeah.
That was like 20 years ago. At the time I was talking to him, it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
That was like 20 years. That was 2 decades ago. Why have they not done any more of these stratification analyses? And in a very rare moment, he said, "Well, they're not really in the business of shrinking their demographic, right?" And I say this with, I feel like I could almost make the pro-statin case better than most if you look at it in terms of a real scientific approach of actually stratifying for the real risk windows,
What
right?
do you mean?
In other words, let's say that if I had a hold of the data at the CTT right now, I could say with huge confidence that there's a massive benefit to statins. How did I get to that conclusion? Well, sure enough, after doing a reanalysis, it turns out that there's a window of time of, let's say, I'm just making things up here, let's say 18 months following an event. And people 18 months following an event have this huge benefit that I can show that's an NNT of 8 or something like that, right? Now, why do I think that this is possible? That what I'm saying, even though it's hypothetical, could be possible? Well, because instead of actually isolating down that window of confirmed benefit, it's to the business advantage for that not to be stratified and for it to spread loose with the rest of the population being examined, right? So that the isolatable risk at a population level is still at least somewhat identifiable, but you're intentionally leaving it diluted among everybody else, right? So I want to emphasize, I don't know that this is true, naturally, but this is a concern I have when I see an analysis like that not only getting done, showing how relevant metabolic health is with what your actual risk association would be, or at least what the benefit could be and this was in 4S was secondary prevention, by the way. But that if that stratification was further followed up, it could turn out that being metabolically healthy post-heart attack could be one of your best benefits, which I think is kind of obvious to me, but it'd be great to have better data on it anyway.
Yeah, it seems obvious to me too.
Such that having specifically a statin may not yield any benefit. But I totally understand why they wouldn't prefer that data to be as widely available. It's not a conspiracy theory thing I'm saying. It's just that there's no good reason for that data to be made available, right?
Well, also one argument could be said that they're going to focus all their attention on the sickest population, right? The individuals that
Sure.
are, have all these
But
other risk
even
factors.
within the sickest population, you can still stratify. Right?
Yeah.
And it's a walled garden. We're never going to see that data. We're never going to get an independent analysis of those data that they have, like at the CTT, right? That's off the table. And this is why I don't even like talking about statin data. A big part of it is that it seems like everybody has to land in one of two camps. Either, no, it's amazing. It's like the best data ever. There's all these trialists that have pooled it all together, and that's why it's like undeniable. And then you have the other group that's kind of like, nope, it's absolutely a fixed game. There's no way that they and I'm just an unknownist. I'm saying the more opaque the data is, the less I'm interested in it. Not that I'm going to assume that it's, money grubbing scientists and doctors out to kill us all. I don't come to that conclusion. I genuinely think, and I feel like I can never say this enough, genuinely, I think that the vast majority of doctors mean well by their patients, mean to do the best that they can to heal. Do I think that there are greedy executives that exist in all industries? Yes. Am I anxious to point fingers? No. But in the case of lean mass hyperresponders, we were able to go get our own data. It's direct, and it's on people who are exceptionally metabolically healthy. And if you want to draw a line and say, well, here's where they cross the line and they're exceptional different unicorns, you still have to describe to me why that line is there. Mm-hmm. What does make them different beyond the metabolic health and being fat adapted that makes the lipid hypothesis not apply to them, but it does apply naturally to everyone else when all of this other data are in compromised populations, right? Where there's these clusters, including things that affect the lipid levels themselves.
Yeah. Do you put any stock on like the general effect size of statins? And like, because what we're talking about is plytropy, right? That statins have an effect on a number of different, I don't know, mechanisms, if you want to call them that. But the greatest effect is on ApoB levels, or at least that's the assumption, right? So how do you think about that? Do you think that the fact that it has a 30% reduction, for example, in ApoB, does it basically, even if it had pleiotropic effects, it's 90% of the benefit that you get from statins. So that would then point towards ApoB being one of the main factors or the main factor.
I don't know. In part, I will say this. I've always had a difficult time with the concentration gradient. To get extra technical and mechanistic, with the concentration gradient version of the lipid hypothesis.
Okay.
We touched on this a little bit before, and
we did.
I'll jump right into it. If you're, I haven't seen anything that's convinced me yet that the concentration levels of ApoB lipoproteins in and of themselves induce greater transcytosis of those ApoB lipoproteins by endothelial cells. So the endothelial cells would theoretically have almost a natural inclination to pick up more of them because transcytosis is an active process.
Do you want to explain what transcytosis
Yes,
is for people
I probably should. Before we jump down this rabbit hole. Okay, so what's going on here? First of all, the lumen, what we're talking about, is on the inside of the tomb. It's where the bloodstream is flowing itself. And on the tube walls themselves is the endothelium, which is this layer of cells called endothelial cells. And the endothelial cells, they are amazing cells. They actually do a lot of work, and particularly in the artery and close to the heart, they, fun fact and no and tell, you could argue that they're just as important in their muscular vascular control as the heart. They even help squeeze down the blood. Anyway, just saying, they're so fascinating. And as another rabbit hole, get into perivascular fat. That's really super fascinating. But anyway, these endothelial cells, they have, you probably heard of the glycocalyx.
Yep.
And the glycocalyx is, I like to call it fur, but basically it's these stalks that kind of stick out and they make it slick. And then protruding through the fur that's on the top of these endothelial cells are receptors, a wide variety of receptors. I think we're still discovering different receptors that extrude through the cell, and they are, I sometimes relate them to fishing lines with specialized bait on them, right? But they have these binding domains. And in the case of lipoproteins, there are specified binding domains depending on what the receptor is. And the one you hear about the most is the LDL receptor, but there are actually many, including a VLDL receptor. And what happens is the lipoprotein, it has a ligand, which is like the, let's call it the keyhole to the key that's at the end of the fishing line, and so it can bind to it. And getting back to lipoprotein lipase, that's one way in which you can get the the triglycerides off of it, right? Okay. So circle me back to the point that I was jumping into on the, what was it that I was?
Oh, you're talking about the concentration
Oh,
gradient.
the concentration gradient. Yes. Okay. So here's where math comes in really handy. I'm curious if you know this one. How much volume of all of our blood do LDL particles take up?
Oh, that I have no idea.
Like, just take a wild guess.
I'm going to guess a really small percentage because I suppose I just think of the cell matter. I think about the albumin. I think about all these other factors that are found in our bloodstream. So I would say a minority. I mean, but a massively small minority.
It is a massively small minority.
Okay.
If my math is correct, and I've double checked this with ChatGPT and some
Oh,
others,
okay.
right? It's maybe in the neighborhood of like 1,000 nanomoles, I believe, is 1,000th. So it's less than 10% of 1%.
Okay.
Now, this is just the pool of LDL particles for a male adult of 5 liters of blood,
Which is the majority of the ApoB proteins.
which is the majority of the ApoB proteins, correct. Now, full disclosure, you can actually see lipoproteins in the blood if they have high levels of triglycerides. In that circumstance, hypertriglyceridemia is what it's called. You can actually, when they centrifuge it, you can actually see a foam. But those aren't LDL. Those are chylomicrons and potentially very large VLDL. But that's before, for example, with VLDL, that's before they've remodeled to LDL, which are so much smaller.
Gotcha.
So an LDL particle is 22.5 nanometers. That's crazy, crazy, super, super small, right? So bearing in mind that we're talking about a small total pool of LDL particles, granted distributed among the lumen all throughout our circulature, right? The concentration gradient is actually relatively tiny, particularly given its comparison to massive cells like red blood cells, right, which are substantially larger.
Yeah.
There's not, to my awareness, anything that stimulates specifically greater transcytosis to the characteristics of an LDL particle, even if there are LDL receptors. And I don't know that there's been anything that's identified showing, for example, that there's more mRNA, right? So you would expect if a higher concentration of LDL particles came in, if we were to biopsy lean mass hyperresponders, for example,
Okay.
look at their endothelial cells, theoretically, they would have more mRNA for receptors related to endocytosing or transcytosing LDL particles.
Yes, most likely. I mean, but there are multiple pathways by which LDL can cross the endothelium, right?
Right, which we should get into in a
But
second.
we'll focus on transcytosis. But I guess
But
it's just difficult to answer that when there are other pathways that could make up for a lack of mRNA expression, for example.
right, but I do want to kind of cross this part off the list succinctly because it's a key point. It's a key point. If the present day lipid hypothesis relies predominantly on transcytosis being the major means of mechanism by which LDL particles go from the bloodstream in the lumen to the subintimal space, then that's a super relevant question as to whether literally the concentration gradient actually self-enforces its own transcytosis to the other side on the question of transcytosis itself, right? Okay, so let's put a pin in that one for a second. So that's the transcytosis bucket, specifically stimulus of the by concentration stimulus to transcytosis. Now let's go to the other side, which is going to be the junction gaps, right?
Yeah.
And you stated this previously, not only in your other videos, I think you mentioned it briefly in our conversation. Things like diabetes can result in a wider junction gaps than are typical for endothelium.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Blood pressure can affect it as well.
Right. But that's the degree with which things passively move through junction gaps with regard to LDL particles themselves this is where it's another place where it didn't make a lot of sense to me, given the mass of LDL particles. So I think to kind of set the stage a little bit more, the endothelial cells themselves are gigantic, like the surface area is gigantic by comparison to these LDL particles.
Yeah.
And given how small they are, their movement with the, I believe it's laminar flow, right,
Yep.
is much more out of their control relative to a larger object, like, say, a red blood cell. But for the most part, there's not a lot of capability for them to come directly at a junction gap, right?
Okay. I'm following you.
Now, where I'll go ahead and throw in a wrench to that, to steel man the other side, is I do believe that there's regular maintenance, such as endothelial cell apoptosis,
Yeah, I was going to mention the turnover aspect. Yep.
and that's happening all the time. Regular maintenance and turnover, or for that matter, just site-specific inflammation that's part of just your general upkeep, is a standard,
Yeah.
right? But that's happening everywhere. That's not just happening, at the LAD only. That's happening throughout the vasculature.
That's true. There is an increase in endothelial turnover because of turbulent flow. So you mentioned laminar flow. There's turbulent flow that can lead to endothelial turnover that happens at the bifurcation points, which is
Right.
where we typically see the greatest levels of atherosclerosis. And that can affect, obviously, the gap junctions and whatnot. But it also actually affects the amount of time that LDL stays in a particular region, which was, I don't know, I mean, we had talked about the European Society or European Atherosclerosis Society. I don't know which word comes first, doesn't matter. But we had discussed that paper, and they have other papers as well where they go into the pathophysiology and whatnot. And they discuss how when you have this turbulent flow that LDL can stick around, not actually bound to the proteoglycans in the subendothelium yet, but because of this flow, they just sort of kind of do this circular motion where they stay around the bifurcation point, which allows them greater entry or greater, I guess I should say, potential for entry past the endothelium, especially as the endothelium turns over. So I don't know how much of a contributor that is. Like, I'm trusting these researchers to know what they're talking about. So who knows? But that would at least give some explanation as to how you do get this LDL transport or movement, I should say, because it's not really transport, movement that is independent of something like transcytosis. We wouldn't even necessarily call that paracellular. It could be, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, but now we're getting to this other bucket.
Yeah.
That junction gaps where there's turbulent flow are probably more vulnerable, in part because of the mechanical stress.
I think that the way that I understood it is that it doesn't matter if you're the healthiest person on planet Earth, if you have the lowest blood pressure, all that stuff. No matter what, this is happening to a degree. And that's where the concentration gradient makes the difference. But again, I'm trusting these researchers.
So here's another way I would put it. I like to use this analogy. I like to use the analogy of roofers. Right now, we're in Las Vegas. If I had to do some roofing, that wouldn't be a problem. It's nice and sunny out, pretty even weather. If I was in the Florida Keys and there was just hurricane after hurricane, I would have a very difficult time roofing over there. In fact, I'd probably give up at points and just plastic over things, right? I think that analogy helps apply to why turbulent flow is relevant
Okay.
with things like turnover of endothelial cells, or for that matter, any kind of infarct or anything in that area. It's just more difficult for processes like efferocytosis, like actual tissue repair. You have these extremely sophisticated, macrophages. I was telling you about how much I love macrophages last
you
time.
did.
I only love them more and more every time I learn more about them. They're this like super emergency worker that does it all and like changes, and they're amazing. Anyway,
They're cool. They're super cool.
yeah. So macrophages are usually there at the scene, either acting in the pro-inflammatory state of trying to get things under control to when things are in control, then trying to repair. But they can only work with the circumstances they're dealt, right?
Yep.
So if it's a complex injury, a complex vascular injury, they've got more work to do. And I would argue probably that's where you're going to see lots of calcification, because it's basically it's a cost benefit scenario where our bodies are smart enough to go, okay, this area just needs to get paved. It's the plastic on the roof, right? We got to do something. We not only have to stop the flow, but we'll go ahead and induce these processes that are ultimately going to result in greater calcification, because at least we can stabilize this breach, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So my understanding is, from the calcification point, is that it's smooth muscle cells that migrate to the area to create this cap, and some of them de-differentiate. So for those listening, migration just literally means that they're moving from where they typically are, which is in this kind of under the endothelial cells in a region, and then they move to closer to the endothelial layer, and then they try to essentially pave themselves over the plaque formation, the atheroma. And then from there, they sort of go through the term de-differentiation, where they essentially forget that they're smooth muscle cells, and they turn themselves into more of an immune type cell as well as a fibroblast. So they start laying down collagen, start laying down different proteins, which creates the fibrotic cap. And then from there, they can also start to deposit calcium, which ultimately leads to the calcification of that region. So I think that there is an immune component. Wouldn't shock me at all, especially since the smooth muscle cells some of them do start turning into almost like an immune component. But yeah, so I guess that's been my understanding up to this point.
Yeah. So now let's go back to the other bucket again for transcytosis.
Okay.
I have a slide for you,
Okay.
if you don't mind, because we're all sophisticated like that.
Okay.
Let me actually skip through these because I want to show you some of those too. But I believe. Oh, did I not have it? I didn't bring it with me. Okay, let me actually reset this real quick. We're not a fully grown podcast yet, I guess. I thought I had been so prepared for that too. I'll show you some of these other slides too if they come up.
Okay.
They're in that same 2020 EAS mechanisms paper.
Yeah.
They discuss not only transcytosis, but inflammation inducing greater transcytosis.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So exposure to C-reactive protein, for example, increases transcytosis.
Yeah.
And there are other inflammasomes that don't come to mind immediately, but this makes perfect sense to me if you're thinking that ApoB lipoproteins are part of the innate immune response, which is what I brought up to you before.
Mm-hmm.
In essence, that if a cell is damaged, if it's the nature of inflammasomes, for people who are not as familiar with this, is it's a come find me, it's a come here, and it attracts immune cells. And chemokines are a good example, all kinds of kines, right? And in the process of doing that, the cell is actually upregulating, again, an active process of transcytosis. And I think I didn't fully detail this before. The reason I keep emphasizing active is up until literally 5-6 years ago, the world of lipidology considered the process by which LDL gets behind and into the subintimal space as predominantly a passive process, which is to say it's pushed in there through the junction gaps and so forth. Right now, even people like Dayspring think that it's predominantly transcytosis. I agree. I think it's predominantly transcytosis, but I think that's actually baked into the recipe because these damaged cells transcytose unmodified LDL particles into that subintimal space. And the fact that it's active means that I can say it's by design because you have to transcribe and translate the proteins that are chaperoning this vesicle from one end, from the lumen, into that subintimal space.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned at COSI yesterday that you're familiar with the fact that they bind to pathogens, for example, right?
Yeah.
These LDL particles.
Yeah, I've looked at that a little bit.
They also have, and I think I mentioned this before in a prior podcast, alpha tocopherol and other antioxidants, which actually protrude the monolayer so they can bind to reactive oxygen speed. I think we're going to continue to find more and more data to support the likelihood that the immune response is in fact using them to be part of that dogpile effect that is common to the innate immune response. It's to try to say, okay, there's a problem here. Let's pack this whole place up. And I think my hypothesis, ApoB lipoproteins could almost be considered non-nucleated immune cells effectively. That macrophages actually make use of them because they're easier to collect than the smaller pathogens that the LDL particles are binding to. Another thing I brought up with you before is I think they're also used for structural demand, so that monocytes, when they're differentiating into macrophages, probably soak up a lot more of these LDL particles so that they can take them into the lysosomes and incorporate them into their bilayer to structurally expand. I think that's going to be more and more a thing that gets both discovered and determined to be of benefit with ApoB lipoproteins, that they provide structural demands for cells. We've chatted before about muscle cells, myocytes, right? Same thing with fat cells, which gets back to the lipid energy model. I think there's a structural demand for adipocytes because they're very elastic.
Yeah,
they need to grow to accommodate their content. So if you're powered by fat, you're putting away triglycerides a bit more. And it may only be tiny little minute amounts that it's increasing and decreasing, but that can add up to a lot.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's relevant when looking in terms of immune demand for help from the immune cells, if they can be adjunct help for a lot of these processes.
So in this line of thought, you would think of LDL as an additional immune response, a part of that immune response, benefiting like macrophages, monocytes, etc.
I think so. And I will caveat that there is, at a minimum, in my larger hypothesis, some degree of a control component. So, for example, I think that atherosclerosis, reminder, this is a hypothesis, I think atherosclerosis to some degree is a stage of homeostasis. So primary homeostasis is like the platelet plug. It's super simple, goes away quick. Secondary homeostasis, now it's much more complicated. You've got the clotting cascade, et cetera. Somewhere between secondary homeostasis and full-blown occlusion of massive plaque buildup is some version of, hemostasis is what I mean to say, not homeostasis.
Gotcha.
Hemostasis, hemo being blood, stasis being control. Hemostasis, somewhere between secondary hemostasis and full-blown, atheroma, is some measure of plaque that develops and goes away. That's my belief. That macrophages actually are pros at this. And when there's a site of inflammation and the innate immune response is engaged and a lot of LDL particles accumulate there, that it's really part of the existing playbook and it's mostly under control depending on how bad the damage is. If it's not too bad, they probably handle it and then ultimately go away because macrophages move.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I realize that a lot of the present literature and a lot of the present thought process is that LDL particles get there, they can
Get oxidized.
oxidized,
Yeah.
Macrophages go eat it and they stop for whatever reason and just die. And then others come and try to deal with it and it's just this positive feedback loop. But I've had a tough time ever buying that. That's just the natural state of LDL particle deposition that it just causes this cascade. It never goes away. Nothing ever happens. I think we're going to ultimately find in time, or maybe there already are studies out there I just haven't found yet, that demonstrate this mobility and capability and control that I think exists there in the innate immune response.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I guess what the proponents of the lipid heart model would say is that the whole process is pathology, right? So I guess you're saying that along the way it kind of switches to pathology, but initially it's not. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, here's the harder piece to elucidate.
Okay.
We right now have animal models where we denude their carotid arteries, for example. We cause an injury. It causes atherosclerosis. We create a site of atherosclerosis.
Yeah.
So I feel like the response to injury hypothesis is well proven at this point. And yes, at the same time, I acknowledge, as I have before with you, that doesn't mean that it's mutually exclusive from the potential of a response to retention hypothesis. The problem is that that's now a confounder that you have to be able to eliminate to prove the response to retention hypothesis.
Yeah.
And that's super hard to do because almost all versions by which you can give atherosclerosis quickly are unnatural, I guess you could say, right?
Oh, that's true. Yeah. I mean,
it's very difficult to give it to animals in a very rapid speed unless you give them a very, species inappropriate diet. Oftentimes you have to do transgenic rodents or, all kinds of ways in which you've got to alter nature to make something happen. But that's the challenge, is that in order for us to confirm or disconfirm that atherosclerosis is happening naturally, right? And that we can track its progression in such a way that inflammation is not the first step, we have to catch it in the act. And that's super hard to do, right?
yeah, it is.
So ideally, you find a species, even better if it's human, that are not already hyperinflamed, that aren't on a species inappropriate diet, right? And it'd be great if they happen to have super high levels of LDL. And that's why I think lean mass hyperresponders are providing this new opportunity, because it's providing the outcome data. Getting back to the point you were talking about before, these mechanistic concepts I've had in my head for like the longest time. And getting back to the larger arc, the physics just didn't make sense to me as far as the LDL particles just being passively deposited. So I have it in my social media past regularly stating that I think transcytosis is going to be a part of the process of atherosclerosis, while simultaneously acknowledging that, yeah, of course, I think ApoB lipoproteins are components of it. I think you can aggressively lower ApoB, but in the same way, if you aggressively lowered monocytes, you'd have less atherosclerosis. If you aggressively inhibited inflammation, you'd have less atherosclerosis, but both of those have big trade-offs.
Yeah, to speak to that, I mean, I'm sure you're aware there are studies that have done exactly that, where they only, quote unquote, only, right? Because of the whole pleiotropic effects, they only target inflammation. And it's true, atherosclerosis is diminished, as in the rate of atherosclerosis is diminished. But the trade-off, to your point on that, is that people tend to experience greater infections or greater cancer risk and things of that nature. So I think that's where we come back. And, I can't speak to the physics and whatnot. Again, like a lot of my education on the topic is a certain level of trust that I have in the researchers that are dedicating their lives to, cholesterol research or ApoB research and whatnot. I don't have the luxury of, going, to that depth where I mean, I can understand the mechanisms and whatnot, but I can't be doing like the calculations and whatnot because I have to be covering a lot of other topics as well.
Right.
Even though I find this one to be absolutely mind-blowingly cool and fascinating, and I'd like to get, answers. That's one reason why I'm here. But yeah, so there's this trade-off with reducing inflammation, and I guess that's the idea of like why reducing ApoB levels to that point, that cutoff point that's been described before, is the natural way of dealing with things because there's no drawback. Again, I'm saying that with quotations because that's the assumption that there's no drawback to it. And then, people will critique, well, you might have cognitive issues, your body needs cholesterol. I've heard that one 1,000 times before. And that's been well addressed.
Technically, that's true.
100%, 100% true. Yeah, absolutely. But there's a wide range between your body needs cholesterol and we need to have sky high LDL for that to be the case, or even to have, quote unquote, normal LDL for that to be the case. So yeah, just getting that number below that cutoff point then essentially stops this whole process, or that's the idea at least. But yeah, I mean, you could target any of these different areas if it's inflammation or whatever it might be. But the trade-off there is too great. So why not just target ApoB? Which again, the idea then is that there is no trade-off.
Let's get into that because that was another thing we kind of left off on and we didn't get too far before.
Yeah.
Let's talk about statistics modeling and all-cause mortality.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Our favorite pet subject, right?
Yeah.
So the one thing that you were passionate about at the end of our prior conversation was that a lot of people latch on to the correlation is not causation,
Yeah.
and you feel it's a bit it's a bit taken too far, right? Go ahead and expand on that.
Yeah, as in it's just repeated almost like drone-like. It's just if people see I got two things to say. One, people see it's an epidemiological study and they say, well, correlation isn't causation. So let me just not even bother reading this study. But what's comical is that when it comes to other things, blood pressure, insulin resistance, any of these other more established markers and risk factors that people just more or less universally agree are problematic, you don't hear that critique, which I just find, I just want to state, I just find that very comical. Anyway, but yes, correlation is not causation. I still think that's true. But as statistics has been developing over the many decades, we've started to get to this point where we can control for different variables and whatnot. Now, to be clear, I'm not stating that I am an expert in controlling for these different variables and stuff. Again, I have to rely on researchers and biostatisticians, which I have taken some time to reach out to biostatisticians, sit down with them, and have them explain to me, how this kind of stuff works in general. But have I done these kinds of like controls and whatnot? No, I haven't. So there's a certain level of trust again in the researchers that do this kind of research that you can control for these different variables, which ultimately solidifies it. I wouldn't say that it ever gives you 100% answer, but it increases with each controlling variable that you're able to account for. It increases your likelihood that you're aiming at the right direction. And I don't think that a lot of people give that enough credit. And I'm assuming that your perspective, and I'm sure you'll give it again, which is that we can't necessarily rely on this, maybe the specificity of some of these controls. Is that somewhere in the ballpark?
You're of course familiar with Bradford Hill.
Yeah.
I'm a Bradford Hill stan.
Okay.
I love Bradford Hill. I think that I think that a lot of folks claim they meet Bradford Hill's threshold, but to be fair, and this is often a missed point by many people, Bradford Hill's super a towering icon in epidemiology. He had his Bradford Hill criteria, which a lot of people hear about the Bradford Hill criteria, and it's these different assessments. The three we probably hear about the most are strength, consistency, and temporality. So when something's super strong, it means that the exposure to the outcome are both super high and highly correlated, right? The consistency is that it shows up in multiple lines of evidence. That's brought up a lot, for example, with the EAS paper and so forth, right? Now, this is where one of my first objections is going to come in. Bradford Hill, getting back to the strength, would consider, and he was most famous for coming after smoking. He felt that smoking was bad and gave these assessments to show how his criteria showed that the threshold level of hitting his criteria for smoking, for example, causing lung cancer was very strong, right? He didn't have an endpoint where it's like, ding, 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 you got it. You've confirmed it.
Sure.
He acknowledged that observational data did have that limitation.
Yeah.
But that said, even in his initial speech where he outlined these criteria, I'm not sure, but I think this was in his initial speech. He brought up when it came to either cardiovascular disease or all-cause mortality, smoking was still just barely a 2 on like the hazard ratio, and he didn't consider that very strong. Okay. He said in his speech. And I think a lot of people since then, myself included, would be like, okay, I kind of don't even want to look at something until it hits a 2, right? So that you can actually see that there's at least enough there. I think that statistics these days goes way, 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 way less than a 2.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
And makes a causal claim. So my objection is not whether or not we can look at data that has a much, less associative degree than 2 for the hazard ratio and not consider it meaningful information. I would consider it meaningful information. I like the term hypothesis building, even though it may sound like a dismissal. It might be like, oh, it's just a hypothesis. I'm not going to listen to anything more you say.
Okay.
I think what you do is you say, there seems to be a relationship here. These two variables have a correlation. And here's the strength level of it. Okay, maybe it doesn't hit a 2, 3, et cetera, on the hazard ratio side, but there might be something here. It's worth looking closer. But it's actually enough for me to act on myself. I may not be convinced that the evidence proves causality beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's given me enough information that I can work off of that hypothesis and recognize the relative strength of what it is. And what frustrates me, Nick, is that nobody gives that answer seemingly in the nutrition space. It either is or it isn't. It's either completely dismissible and you can just throw it out into the garbage and be like, that correlation is not causation, end of discussion. Mm-hmm. Or no, we have enough evidence to say X causes Y. Yeah. Like red meat causes cancer. Mm-hmm. Right. If you look closer, by the way, they would say actually it's what is it, it's grade
like
1A, class 1A or whatever. It's actually probably causes cancer, which I feel is kind of a bit hedgy.
It's true.
And then everyone runs with it who's pro getting rid of red meat goes, hey, red meat, they already said so. I forgot what the organization is, but they say I
think it's the WHO.
Yeah. The WHO says.
No one skewer me for saying that word.
Yeah.
Some people get really upset about that one too.
And it's like, I don't see any problem saying this organization thinks X causes Y.
Sure.
I have a problem with
the certainty.
The certainty. It's the confidence in the certainty. That's my main objection.
Well, it goes back to my point about the arrogance, right?
Right.
The idea that, I mean, and that's true. That's a great point. I agree that, especially when we talk about nutrition, when a lot of these studies come out, that people then jump on them and then just use that and say, well, it might be a correlation study and there may be many adjustments and whatnot, but it's proving that red meat in this example is causing cancer or whatever it might be. And I think the WHO, I'm pretty sure it's the WHO that said that. I could be a little bit off, but they probably add the word probable because, just like almost any other scientist, they have to say, well, we can never be 100% certain about anything. So, but it does leave this gap of, okay, well, what does probable mean? Is that a 1% uncertainty or is that a 20% uncertainty?
Right.
And a lot of this stuff is so context-less, right?
Right.
And you start getting to the individual level and everything is context-less almost. To the point, unless you do exactly to your point about Bradford Hill for the strength of the association, unless it's just overwhelming, then the context becomes less and less of an issue because it starts almost applying to everyone, no matter what. Smoking, I mean, maybe there's this rare gene that we just haven't discovered that protects you completely from smoking and cancer and whatnot. But the odds are really high that if you start smoking, that you're increasing your risk, we'll just say substantially. So yeah, I agree with you. I can absolutely see that. I think where epidemiologists might come in, and again, this is pure speculation on my point, because I don't know. I haven't done this kind of research, but I would imagine that they would probably argue that the statistical models have moved beyond Bradford Hill and have started having greater specificity to the point where you can move that threshold down from, let's say, 2, and they do feel more confident at a little bit higher risk or whatever it might be. Again, pure speculation. I don't know.
No, and for what it's worth, I think that's probably true. I work with Adrian Sotomoda. You got to watch his lecture.
Yep.
Very advanced in statistics.
Yeah, definitely.
And just great guy, by the way. And I do think that there are means by which to better ascertain a higher likelihood of causality. The challenge that I'm sure you're also familiar with is I think the nature of how science is set up today is very problematic, and I do get a bit vocal on this one. For example, the concept of the publisher perish.
Oh, yeah.
Paradigm, along with the fact that it's much more relevant as to whether or not you have positive findings. I think that's one of the biggest issues we have as a species, that we put ourselves in this position of effectively needing to constantly have something new to bring that must be super relevant because that'll advance our careers. There's very little incentive, to replicate other people's experiments, and potentially even further less to be at odds with them, especially if it's a negative finding, right? And that's a big deal to me. It's a really big so this isn't my idea. It was already suggested before, but it's what I think should happen, which is that I think that studies should be done in 2 phases. The first phase is you acquire the funding for the study design, and then you get it registered with who's going to publish it.
Well, they do have this registry, the clinicaltrials.gov, which I very much appreciate that exists. And just as a side note, in relation to study analysis, one of the keys for a good meta-analysis, if you're going to look at one, is if they include clinicaltrials.gov, because it does offer a database of studies that have shown no effect, because they have to report their data to clinicaltrials.gov.
Right. Sorry to cut you off, but just
No,
to
please,
expand, where I was going was with the publication, with the journal.
Okay.
So let's say you're the journal, I'm the science team. I say, here's our study design. Do you like it? And you may even negotiate with me
I see.
on
Yeah.
what you would consider to be a more interesting study design. But your commitment to our team is that it will get published.
Okay.
Once we complete it, you will publish it
Yeah.
with our a priori.
Okay. I like that a lot. Yeah.
Then pressure's off on my team to turn the study into something.
Right.
So p-hacking, all of those things, they would become a thing of the past, because I would, or at least they should. I hopefully don't have other influences pushing me around. There's some of that too.
Yeah, definitely.
But the fact that there's already such a wind blowing on these researchers who just genuinely want to do good research, such that they've got to think about things in these terms, I think is a travesty. I think it's a serious problem with science today.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's really well put. And that solution, I never thought of it that way, but I do like that a lot. It'd be fantastic to have. I think it's more collaborative. It also, I think what it might do too is open the doors for a lot of journals, because a lot of it, I mean, some of it comes down to like which journals you submit to. Also, like, I mean, people are all trying to submit to the biggest journals, or if they don't have great work, they might submit to a really, really bad journal that would basically pay them to submit to their journal. And I think that's another problem as well. And, you know, when you're submitting to Nature, or when you're submitting to Cell, or you're submitting to, I don't know, any one of the, cardiology, JAMA, whatever it might be, you do have a certain level of pressure, right? You want it has to be novel. Nature now has these requirements of, you're not just doing it in cells, you're not just doing it in animals. Now you also have to do it in humans, all in one paper. And it's like that sucks up so many resources from a lab,
Yes.
just so that they can publish and say, I was published in Nature. Not to mention the peer review process, which is very involved for Nature. I mean, it'll go back and forth for months to years before it actually gets published. There's a lot of navigating all these different pitfalls for researchers, and I think making it easier and making it more transparent would be it's a net positive, I think.
I not only couldn't agree more, but frankly, I think under this other paradigm, it should be allowed that you can submit to multiple, because the results aren't in, right? So you could submit to Nature, you could submit to JAMA, you could say, hey, who's ever first interested, you're our first tier of journals we would like to publish under. And then it's on them. Maybe JAMA jumps up first and says, you know what? We'll accept it, because there's nothing more to do on the researcher's side. There's this other component that I haven't had to deal with because we've crowdfunded our study. But as I understand, you have to do all this work to set up a grant. And then it's like you repeat all of that work again for doing the publication, right? Which science is so much about building the hypothesis and the design of the experiment first.
Well,
It's
supposed to.
Exactly, right? And yet we have so much post hoc rebuilding, restructuring, restating.
Sure.
And I'm sorry, I feel like that takes us away from the spirit. This is definitely not what Karl Popper was, imagining that we would be at in 2025. But that I'll concede. I have a problem with that because as an engineer, I often feel like we have more scientific processes in the way we're doing things. But no shade to all the good researchers out there. It's just I wish it wasn't set up this way.
Yeah, I agree. Where would you see the peer review process go in that formula though? If you're already guaranteeing that you'll accept it, what would happen to peer review? How would peer review help in that scenario?
Well, I feel like first of all, another thing that I wish was transparent. I wish all versions of peer review that people sign their names.
Yep.
I have no idea why they don't. Okay, let me put it this way. I wish that people sign their names, and I wish that they were compensated. I wish it was just stock and standard that if you're a reviewer, you're paid for your time, right? It's a again, journals have such power,
Yeah, I
and
agree.
weirdly, all this voluntary work coming their way, but it's because of how much power they have. I think it's got to be a cultural shift. So with peer review, the peer review would be predominantly in that design phase. You're submitting out to all these journals. That's why I say there's a negotiating. The negotiating is part of the peer review itself, where the journal might go, seems like an interesting enough design. Let me go and have these three people who are lipidologists and are, more subject matter aware.
Yep.
We'll have them look at it and see what they say about this design. And one of them comes back and goes, "Oh no, actually, you shouldn't be using this assay, or you should be using this calibration, something to that effect." Oh, okay. They submit that back to the trialists, and the trialists are like, "Oh, okay, actually, that's a good point." They're negotiating back and forth, and eventually, it's determined what the design will be. Now, that doesn't get it completely out of peer review, because I know this from being inside the sausage making. Sometimes there are things that are not noticed by anybody, but that you
Yeah.
do have to respond to in the course of the study. And you should note that, right? You should be transparent about any amendments or any changes, anything along those lines, and that's fine. Probably there's a threshold with which you are allowed to change based on the journal, based on what their rules are. But they should already be a part of that conversation if they've already predetermined they're going to publish it. Again, though, that's fine. That's way more scientific, in my opinion, and way more understandable, and making it less likely you'll make mid, you know,
Corrections
mid
halfway through.
midway corrections.
Yeah.
It's another place where I don't love where the state of science is right now. I already know that there are a lot of trials that make midway corrections and changes. Not saying they're all unjustified. Just saying that, of course, it attracts scrutiny from the people who want to be dismissive of the findings.
Sure. Yeah, there are certain things that scientists have done. It doesn't address everything for sure. Like displaying the data as per protocol analysis versus intention to treat, stuff like that, so that you're not just cutting away certain people based off of some arbitrary criteria. Like you can look at both data sets and make a conclusion on, okay, which one seems more appropriate? Like which one do I think fulfills the actual question that you're asking, like which one is actually giving you the most robust answer, the best answer. The one issue that I foresee, and I'm curious if you have rebuttal to this, is if you were to provide this to the journal and they were to give it out to, let's say, 3 peer reviewers, most likely those peer reviewers are probably going to be in the same field, same area, potentially same research or similar research.
Mm-hmm.
So
Maybe they already worked at your lab.
maybe they worked at, yeah, exactly, absolutely. So how do you think you would incentivize this system if a lot of researchers, one of their greatest fears is getting scooped, especially after years of work on a particular topic?
Names in the open.
Names in the open.
It's-
So would you is there like an embargo where you are not allowed to publish a similar trial at the same time until that one finishes, or how would you foresee that?
You and I could not easily determine a one-size-fits-all rule. That actually makes a lot of sense to be determined at the publisher level, right? So you couldn't easily scoop lean mass hyperresponder data. The reason I know that is because I run the largest lean mass hyperresponder Facebook group by far.
Sure.
Right. I already know it'd be difficult for, some other trialist to jump in and
Yep.
recruit to the same degree. So let's say I was talking to a would-be journal and they were saying, okay, yeah, let's work out this trial design. You're correct in this new paradigm. The concern would be that one or more of the peers would go, oh, did you know that these guys are going to be doing a lean mass hyperresponder study? And I could tell the journal, I'm not as concerned about it because I kind of know these guys. I know that they're not going to be looking at it as much. But it's true, for something else that's more competitive, that might be a concern.
That happens in cell biology a lot. I mean, where researchers will keep things close to the vest until at least they've submitted it to a journal. They may get rejected right away and they have to go to other journals, but they have such a head start that, or they'll put it up on like a server like bioarchives, where then they at least say, hey, look, we've done the research. It hasn't been peer reviewed yet, but we're in the process of doing that.
Right.
So over the next 6 months, it'll eventually pop up. So then they get the credit for having published the paper when they did. And this happens a lot in cell biology, where it's not necessarily that people are like, oh, I want to do exactly what they're doing, but sometimes you do find an avenue that is really interesting that, another group did. And it just so happens that you're both chasing the same thing without even realizing it, and yeah, it would suck if, if you get to the end and then, one of those papers ends up not getting published or whatever it might be.
This helps solve that, right? If two were unknowingly racing each other, but they both got their respective journals to register that they will publish, solved, right?
Yeah.
As long as it's known who the peers are who reviewed it, also, you putting your design, your study design into the journal, getting it negotiated in advance, even if another one tried to scoop you, but they had to register theirs with their respective journal, and it was later, even if they had a shorter time to turn it around, right? This helps with that as well.
It might, on the opposite end, it might discourage some researchers from continuing that line of research, right? Because if they see that one group submitted 6 months ago to a different journal, and then they weren't aware, and then they are made aware, they may end up just completely scrapping it and going a different direction.
But that's only if they were one of those few peer reviewers that was talking about it early on. So it's true in a smaller field of where there's just a handful and they all know each other. It's possible that, but I doubt it. I genuinely feel like this would be so much more pro researcher and
I agree.
and so much less pro journal.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just pointing out like potential, things that would need to be figured out. But I mean, overall, no doubt, it's an overall benefit.
Yeah. All right, we covered lipidology quite a bit.
Okay.
Tell me what you're the most fascinated with right now. What have you really been sinking your teeth into?
Well, with me, I'm covering multiple topics every week. So I have a huge list of topics that I go over, and I knock off 1 to 2 every week, release the videos and whatnot. So I have to do a ton of background research on each topic. And I don't know. I mean, for me, everything is equally fascinating. I suppose I'll just point out, okay, so people are really interested in vitamin D as an example. So I started looking into vitamin D on a really basic outcome, which is bone mineral density, because that's common when you're talking about vitamin D and the effect that it has on bones. And I was shocked by how complicated this whole process is. Going back to our mechanisms discussion, we think of, okay, vitamin D helps our bones, so therefore we should, be getting a certain amount of vitamin D. And it's way more complex than that. There's, researchers are now arguing that there may be like 2 points at which vitamin D has different effects or similar effects. So if you have too low of vitamin D, then it leads to bone risk. So bone mineral density is not as high. You're not able to accrue as much bone. But then if you have too high vitamin D, the same exact thing happens. And the kicker is what I find fascinating is that the mechanism by which that happens is identical. It's the exact same mechanism, exact same proteins, exact same everything. So how does that happen? It's only the difference in concentration that changes how the cells start expressing their genes. I mean, I think that's just wild. Now, I
In
mean,
difference in concentration in lumen or inside the cell?
no, so they are only able to measure outside the cell. So they're only measuring blood vitamin D levels. But some of these experiments are done in cell work, right? So they're applying a certain amount of vitamin D and then showing or seeing the differences in expression level and the impact that it has on surrounding cells. So it's having an impact on a particular type of bone cell that then further extends by releasing different factors, rank L, OPG, like these different proteins that bind to other bone cells and tell them what to do. You need to mature. You need to become quiescent. You need to stop building bone. You need to start producing bone. I mean, it's a wide range of different things, but it's all based on concentration, which I just found absolutely mind blowing. Because again, you're just always told, vitamin D, it's always good for your bones, which it largely is. I'm not saying that it isn't, but it's just that there's a lot more nuance there, just like there often is. I'm sure you know nothing about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, Own Your Labs is a blood work company that we built.
Yeah.
And part of what we want to do is we want to have this anonymized data set. We incentivize people to submit it.
Oh, yeah.
Things like blood tests for vitamin D, I'm very interested in a lot of these tests that are blood based versus cellular. A good place where this comes up for me is with electrolytes. For a while, I kept ruling out that I needed, for example, sodium because in the blood, I was within range.
Okay.
But I ultimately figured out that at least when I'm especially keto, I need to supplement salt
Interesting. Okay. Why?
because I was getting cramps. I was getting like leg cramps, Charlie horses. My feet were cramping, and I didn't associate it with sodium. I associated it with either magnesium or potassium.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I kept playing with those levels, and it kind of had a little bit of benefit. But I read a paper, I think it was George Henderson who gave it to me, a paper where it basically was making the point that your body ditches other electrolytes to preserve sodium. That's like the trunk of the tree, if you will, and you've got to keep that standard. And I kept ruling out that it could be sodium or salt in general because I've been going hog wild with salt since going keto because I found out from Steve Finney that I could have a lot of it. So I kept ruling it out because I just had plenty on my food. And then fall of 2018, I remember it now because it was such a change. I decided to take 2 weeks and just go crazy and have as much salt as I could stand. So I frosted my burgers and my salmon. And one notable thing was it didn't get too salty for me. My steak would just have all the salt on the top. I was like, that's kind of a clue. But then I also supplemented salt. So I was up to 10 to 12 grams a day, right?
Yeah.
My cramps, everything went away. All of the other symptoms where I'd occasionally get lightheaded, gone, all gone. And the other paper that George Henderson shared with me that I think might be a component is even before I got into nutrition, I figured I had something called fructose malabsorption. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
No.
I think it's from me having a lot of chronic soda drinking since I was a kid. That was a thing my friends and I just drank soda like it was never. Anyway, I think in the development of fructose malabsorption, given that paper he shared with me, that may have been relevant to transport of certain minerals through enterocytes, and I may just have poor absorption.
Well, there is absorption of sodium in the enterocytes by glucose, right? There's a transporter that allows glucose and sodium in at the same time.
Yeah. And so I think it had something to do with the mechanisms there. It's been like several years since I looked at it. All I know is once I started supplementing salt, I'd need to supplement any electrolytes,
Interesting.
period. And as long as I'm doing it, my cramps go away. Now, because I've also done N of 1 experiments, I'm always trying to replicate the ones I've done before for my baseline diet, which is, I won't bore you with it, but it's this very specific diet. But I would drop off having supplemented salt so that I could be the same as what it was in the prior times I've done it. Figuring I had more than enough salt anyway in my diet. But when I'm super keto, which happens on this baseline diet, and I go to a phase where I'm hypocaloric, half of what the diet is. So super keto, hypocaloric, all of a sudden the cramps would come. My feet would literally cramp up on like the third or fourth day of a 5-day phase.
Sure.
And when I got my wide spectrum blood work at the end of that phase, my sodium and chloride both fell below reference range.
Oh, okay.
And what you may already know is you have to be really depleted for it to, because the body's really good at keeping the minerals in the right levels. And that was it for me. At that point, it was like, okay, when I'm being super keto, I just need to be mindful to supplement salt. Now, when I'm less so, when I'm being more permissive, more low carb, that's like between 30 and 100 grams of carbs, less relevant. And especially during the experiments where, like, I did my weight gain experiment, I was eating carbs, didn't need to supplement at all. So there is something relevant to being specifically very low carb for me.
I think, it's funny because that reminds me of some of Nick's arguments that he's put out there of, we look at, and this goes back to LMHR too, goes back to any of these specific situations where you're potentially driving your physiology to be, you're actively doing something to change your physiology in a dramatic way. If that's, let's say if you go very low carb, it's true, and Nick's mentioned this before, and I have a background in bioenergetics, your cells start to use a lot more fat. So you have this massive shift in your metabolism. So it's interesting in your scenario, if something similar might be happening. You said that once you were eating more carbohydrates that you didn't have this issue.
Right.
Yeah. So, and which would put you more into that normal physiology, again, quotes, normal physiology of like how it's usually studied, that most people are consuming some level of carbohydrate, some baseline level. So it's just fascinating to me because it introduces this idea that we should be doing a lot more experiments and sometimes replicating some of the experiments that we did in these quote unquote normal nutrition situations and redoing them in people that are very low carbohydrate. I would argue maybe even people that are extremely high carbohydrate individuals as well, to start to tease out some of the differences, the changes that happen to our physiology as a result.
Well, on top of that, there is individual variability clearly.
Yeah.
Because I know plenty of people on carnivore who don't have any salt. In fact, intentionally try not to, such as Amber or Hearn. However, because I've been so liberal about sharing my salt story, there have been others who've come forward and they're like, that was it. I was also playing with potassium and magnesium and so forth. And sure enough, and Eric Rogers, who follows my work now, he lives by it too. He actually supplements 3 grams of salt per meal.
See, and that's fascinating because if you were to have a conversation with someone who studies, let's say, sodium and blood pressure, for example, they would just focus in on just that one thing.
Right.
I mean, I guess I shouldn't necessarily say it, but in general. And this is, again, going back to this idea of kind of an arrogance that comes from using the literature that we have and then just assuming that everybody kind of fits within that the scale that the present literature provides. And it just doesn't. I stand by the fact that, averages and it does account for a lot, but it doesn't mean that it addresses every single person. And you are on an individual level going to have variations. And it's like we're going to have what I think could be the case is that, and I think Nick would probably agree with this, that you're probably going to have more data sets that you're going to have to, it's like a whole different type of population that you have to start doing experiments on so that you can figure out some of these nuances. LMHR is just one of them, but
Right.
I think that could expand outwards a lot more. And there's going to be certainly a lot of crossover where it doesn't matter which physiology you look at, it's all true. Like, I don't know, let's say weight loss is a net benefit for your health if you're obese. Like, it's, I mean, look, it's possible there might be some exception, but for the most part, it doesn't matter which physiology you'd be looking at, it's going to be largely a benefit to your health.
I'm sure there's some threshold of degree of obesity.
Yeah.
So some people at a certain, but you're right. Mercury exposure is probably universally bad. There's probably
Doesn't
not
matter
some
what you're eating or
right, exactly. Which, by the way, gets to the root of causality. Getting back to Bradford Hill, right? One of my favorite examples to explain causality to a layperson is reason for. So if the reason for why people enter a volcano is irrelevant to whether or not they burn up and die, right? That gets to the heart of something that's independently causal. But if the reason for why you enter a hospital has to do with the association with you dying, as in, are you hospital personnel or a patient? It seems like patients have the greater association. Oh, well, then we can't expect hospitals cause people to die.
Right.
Right. But that gets back to lean mass hyperresponders. Maybe we'll bring it back to this for a sec. I think that there's got to be room. There has to be room to be able to say, we can look at data like we're putting together now, not say this completely obliterates any variation of the lipid hypothesis. But at a minimum, it is challenging the simplistic version of the lipid hypothesis.
Yeah, I agree.
That carte blanche, if you have high LDL, at a population level, you're at a high risk. Because I will always give to, the Peter Attias of the world, just like the 90-year smoker or the 90-year-old smoker who smoked 3 packs a day. That's an anecdote that you can pick out of the air. Mm-hmm. But is there a population? Is there an island out there of people who smoke 3 packs a day, and you're like, wow, they're all, they have a high percentage of centennials or centenarians? That's what I want to say. Yeah. No, that would shock us. We'd be surprised by that information.
Yeah.
So my hope is that there'll just be more people who at least start opening up the door a bit more on the nuance of it.
Yeah, and that's my hope as well. And I think that in defense of kind of the conventional way of looking at things, lipidology or just blood pressure, any of these realms that you want to discuss, I do have to put forward like a strong defense of people that do stick to this general idea that LMHR may still be at risk or in any scenario where you're pushing against the established idea. The established idea is also present because scientists, maybe less so scientists, but definitely clinicians, have to be ultra conservative. They can't just assume that, this is the exception. They have to have data. They have to have a lot of data to start. It's like a massive ship that's needs to turn, and it's not going to turn quickly. It turns very slowly, and the only way for that to turn in any direction is through large amounts of data that we can then provide and say, now, okay, we have enough evidence to say, yes, there is an exception here. This population is an exception. So now we can start looking at that population. We start looking for other populations. I still stand by my stance that there's some level of arrogance there, that we still should be open, but we should be open to the idea that there are these exceptions, and it's not just a single person, but that there could be multiple. But I just want people to understand that not everyone is just saying, I'll use myself as an example. I still tend to go a more cautious route because we simply don't have enough data from my perspective on a lot of these things. It doesn't have to just be LMHR. It can be anything. So the default is to report, to literally just talk as if based off of the data that we have. But going back to our conversation we were just having 5 minutes ago, it is entirely possible. I'm very open to the idea that these different physiologies change how much risk there is, or if there's any risk, or what have you. And I don't think that enough. And the biggest word that I just wish people would really get in their heads is nuance.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I mean, that's the biggest thing. And and one thing talking about AI, which you might appreciate, is, have you ever, like, I'm sure you have, but if a person has ever typed into like these chat GPT models and whatnot, like what causes heart disease, or, whatever it might be, it spits out a really cool answer, very succinct, like, oh, very professional, all that stuff. But there's no nuance ever. I mean, it's not walking you through like, okay, but in this scenario, it's possible that this could be happening. And that's where you start getting into expertise. That's where you get into an open dialogue, having that nuance between people that may think a little bit differently. And I just don't think that we have enough of that.
I agree. I will kind of level set a little bit in that I am kind of pressing for nuance, but part of my pressing for nuance is opening up the door for a lot of what, outside of lean mass hyperresponders are, like, they're often described as an exception. You're describing them as an exception, with the expectation that ApoB causing atherosclerosis is the rule, right? Effectively. So we may find that there is a further sliding, let's say, degree with which metabolically healthy people are not as affected. There's still sort of a default assumption that there's no harm in lowering ApoB, right? Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is also kind of a core assumption that I worry is being made a bit too easily. Because how you change anything physiologically often comes with trade-offs. Usually there's some potential benefit, there may be some potential harm. And the problem is I don't know how much there's an interest in finding the harm of lowering ApoB and LDL specifically. But getting back to the stratification aspect, getting back to the data that we were talking about before,
Yeah.
is there, could I identify, if I had access to data, those people who take an interventional step to lower their LDL, who on net are harmed by the side effects of the thing that they did to lower their LDL? Do I think that's possible? Absolutely, I think that's possible. Yeah. I don't want that to get turned into me stating who they are and why they should do that. But that, I think, is part of how this becomes a sort of a zero-sum game for those who are pro-lipid lowering, is they would say, look, it's better just to be safe and just have your LDL lower, full stop, right? And to the degree with which lean mass hyperresponders are an exception, okay, we'll acknowledge that they're an exception. But in reality, we're not interested in the question beyond that point.
Yeah.
That I really push back on, because there still may be some untold number of people who are taking steps to lower their LDL, and ultimately it's of low benefit for them to detriment.
Yeah.
And I think they deserve to be found out for that being not something that's worth them doing, right? And I think that there's room for both. I think that there's room to say there may be benefit for X number of people taking intervention, and for Y number of people to not take that intervention. But we should all be interested. We should want to find that out.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I completely agree. I think that we're essentially at the infancy of creating these subpopulations of individuals. If that's the positive or the no risk, or finding out where there may be additional risk with some of the conventional medicines that we use, or the different therapies that we use.
But this is a place where I have my complaint again. My complaint is those data are in hand. They're just in hand with folks who may not be as interested in finding where the strata is of people who wouldn't necessarily benefit or might even be harmed, right?
Yeah, and I think it was Dr. Attia that was talking a little bit about that. Not exactly this, but he's talking about how, for example, cognitive risk, some cognitive decline risk with, or like foggy memory and stuff like that on statins. And he was talking with, did you listen to the Dr. Dayspring episode he
The
did?
most recent
Yeah,
one?
the most recent
I think
one.
I've listened to about half of it.
Yeah, it's on, I think, the second half that they discuss that a little bit. And they mentioned that in the analyses that have looked at that and essentially not dismiss the idea that there is no risk, but they've mentioned that it's as a secondary outcome. And what they want to see is a study that's done on primary outcome, where you well know this, but for anybody listening, the difference between that is when you're doing the statistics to figure out how many, let's say, participants that you might need in the study, that you need a larger pool of individuals if you're going to be looking at other outcomes other than the primary outcome. So the primary outcome, you're going to set the statistics primarily to figure out an answer to that primary outcome. But a lot of these analyses that have been done in statins have only looked at it as a secondary, kind of a passing thought. So it kind of speaks to your point of, we kind of have to have that data, right? Like to really be able to say, yes, there's no risk, or there might be a risk for a certain type of person. And then with the fact that you were to look at a primary outcome, that also means that you probably have enough statistical power to do subgroup analyses, to start figuring out, oh, okay, to your point earlier, this group doesn't seem to have any risk of, mind fogginess and whatnot, but this other group that fits these particular parameters does. And that's where I think analyses are super fascinating, where like ChatGPT just can't figure this stuff out, and that's like where you have to look at the subgroups and the sensitivity analyses and figure out where are the trends in the data, and that's what I find fascinating and exciting about data, and looking at these analyses.
Well, and I'm going to register another complaint with RCTs,
Okay.
particularly when it comes to things like these, because you're probably familiar with the run-in period.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is a big problem. How many? So for those who don't know, the run-in period is a trial is begun, but it hasn't actually started. What happens is there's a period before it's officially been randomized between both groups, where actually the entire population of people who may be on said drug take the drug from anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, depending on what they determine. And during that period of time, if they choose to, they can exit the study. And often that can be due to side effects of the
right.
drug.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what does that mean? Well, that means at the point where they then randomize between both groups, it's definitely going to be less likely that the intervention group would have side effects that would lead them to want to leave the study earlier, and therefore less likely it gets reported. And don't take my word for it. There's plenty of scientists who've written about this and it being a problem and it skewing the results such that these studies often can say, hey, you've got all this benefit and it has very little side effects. But you can't know for sure if the run-in period didn't get rid of the statistical relevance of the side effects that are actually going to be seen in the field. And this is actually a place where statins come up quite often, is it's thought that these run-in periods are the reason why the side effects are so much more prominent out with surveillance data where people are actually getting in. Clinicians are complaining that it's a little bit more prevalent. And this is a bit of my frustration with trying to do this post hoc analysis, is it's already not a good pool of data, which, again, I can't say this enough times. This brings me back to my original point, which is I don't want to make a statement as regard to whether or not you should choose these treatments with your doctor, work with your doctor. But do I think it's a good place to go mine data? No, I don't. And the walled garden thing is probably the toughest part for me, is I want more data to be open, to be available, to be researched, and particularly for the tools we're talking about right now, because I'm very excited about AI as an engineer, because AI, if done right, can help to eliminate these biases. it can do a better job of examining things than we can. Heck, I would love to be able to do more studies where the a priori is to let the machine learning figure out what the best findings are, and for us to be the ones to just gather the data. That I think would come up with. I think you could have so many fascinating things that you identify an interesting population, you do widespread, metabolomics,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And then you're saying, I'm just going to pre-register that the AI is going to find the most fascinating findings and write the paper for us. Our work is just trying to collect it as faithfully as we can. And I'll bet that would advance human intelligence on medicine, nutrition substantially.
Yeah, I completely agree. There are definitely all kinds of issues in science. I mean, it's got a fantastic baseline, and we're making tiny steps to improve it. Just hack away at trying to make small improvements. But it's a long road, and there's a lot more that we still have to do. I'm curious with this run-in period, how many of the statin trials, again, I still need to read a lot of them, but how many of the statin trials have that run-in period?
I think
Do you
all
know?
of them from the 2000s up.
Really?
I'm not
Okay.
sure. I'm not sure about the 90s, but I know that two things happened simultaneously that were interesting. That I believe in 2004, which is that before 2004, there were statin trials that actually had a true placebo group where there was
Yeah.
no statin,
Yeah, I know.
right?
Yeah.
However, they were, like for us, they were like secondary prevention, for example.
Okay.
After 2004, intervention, even for a new drug that was cholesterol lowering, the placebo group would have a statin anyway, which of course creates a kind of confounder. But
Yeah.
part of my problem with that is it sort of bakes it into standard of care,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
because now the default is, hey, you can't even get to data that would actually be able to better examine what current or newer statin therapeutic value would be in that circumstance. I'm going to register one more complaint. One more issue with that I have with these studies is that if I were doing an RCT, a double-blind RCT, I would make it time-based. I don't like when they power them to events where right at the moment there's a statistically significant divide. They go, stop it right there. Stop the study. We could have more of these side effects registered if they went by a time allotment. But there's another factor, which is that you don't know that it's going to be extrapolatable
Yeah.
from where that divide is. Just like if you were watching stocks going up and down,
Sure.
at one point where, Microsoft is well above Apple, you can't be like, and therefore Microsoft will win and Apple will die. And
Right.
because at a certain point, Apple's above Microsoft.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's, how it definitely will go, but that's part of my problem with making those assumptions. That's a theme you and I chat about. And you're right, there's a trust component with how these models are done, including extrapolations. And I'll admit it, I'm the skeptic for the data that's not there.
Sure.
But if you can make it predictive, that's great. Like these same people you're talking about who model with lipids, I'm going to say, give me your model. What model would predict lean mass hyperresponders? What model would predict what their longitudinal data will be that we're about to get, that we're about to publish? Give me that model now, before the data comes. I don't want you to ad hoc change anything, right? I want to see it. Because if there's anything that you can take from all of my experiments, it's that lipid dynamics are they're so fluid.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that there's still so much that's poorly understood that it's hard for me to trust a model took in all of the appropriate variables to better understand how to do it.
Yeah, that's completely fair. I think the one thing that clinicians might say and researchers that do RCTs would say is that they have to power it to events because of ethical considerations as well. So they have to stop the trial at a certain point, and they can't just keep, letting the divide become greater and greater just so that they can get better, I guess, predictability when it comes to the actual overall effect over time. And I think I guess that inflection point where they started, and maybe there could be an argument to be said that maybe statins was added to the usual care. And for anybody that's not aware, what we're talking about is they'll do a comparison of a statin group, let's say at 10 milligrams of a statin versus usual care. That's the kind of overarching theme that they say for like the control group. And that they'll get 2.5 milligrams of a statin or something, just enough of a difference where they'd be able to tease out an actual difference. But I'm assuming that one of the reasons why they do that is because the IRB has become a lot more strict over time to make sure that there aren't any unethical practices that happen. So, I mean, do you think that it's solely because, let's say, statin companies want to force it that way, or do you think that it's ethical considerations, or do you think it's somewhere in the middle?
I think it's a combination.
Okay.
I think that again, I genuinely believe that most people are working on the thing that they believe is helping people believe that they're right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I believe people attribute to malice, overt, intentional malice, is really just motivated reasoning. And to put my cards on the table, probably what a lot of people would consider to be the ethical divide line, I would have differently, such that I just want a greater stringent level of proof, particularly for an intervention that's going to change lives. So you may think, well, there's enough statistically significant difference in this in these two groups, such that we know for sure now we need to put the placebo group on this medication.
Sure.
Right? That's the ethical, and I think it's a fair thing to examine, right? But I would then ask, okay, can we at least look at all prior studies that were time-based, see if all of them, including those that failed, ever had a statistically significant difference between the two groups and then failed? Because for those that happens with, I consider that a bigger ethics violation if you're preventing the failure from being observed.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So, yes, basically, it's a difference. It's kind of like with law, civil versus criminal. Civil is preponderance of evidence.
Yeah.
You feel like one side mostly has a better case than the other, but for criminal, it's a much higher threshold. You've got to feel it's beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Because you've got to take it very seriously before you put somebody to prison for, life. By the same token, if you're talking about lifelong medication, yeah, I think that's worthy of a very high standard of evidence for which you can feel confident it's efficacious. And that's also why I do have a problem with how much it gets extrapolated. I'm sure you've heard me talk about this many times before, and I'll say it again. I don't like how much these populations that you mentioned are populations that are compromised, do have these clusters of confounders I was talking about before, and for which they then extrapolate over to healthy populations. The study that you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
that you said that was funded independently,
Yep.
which I'll double check on that one because I always feel a little cautious on that.
Sure.
But if it's on healthy individuals, I'm going to head straight to the methods. If it's a short methods set of paragraphs, I'll feel good about it. If it's long, if it includes a lot of modeling, if it includes a lot of adjustments,
I see what you mean.
I'm naturally going to feel a bit more skeptical because I feel like it's trying to answer a question that's been floating. There's a lot of these kinds of analyses where it's a bit post hoc. There seems to be a prevailing statement made like, oh, cholesterol doesn't matter as much when you're 75 and older. And then all of a sudden, a few years later, there's literally a paper that says, is cholesterol bad when you're 75 and older? And it seems to specifically make that case. But when it makes it, it's with 18 paragraphs of methodology, a lot of work to get to that point. And this is not me saying, and therefore it can be tossed out. It is me saying, though, think back to what I was saying about motivated reasoning. That, oh, this isn't the result I thought it would be.
Yeah.
Maybe I needed to, oh, here it is. It's because I needed to account for this. I needed to account for that.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
get
the
that.
problem I have with especially post hoc sensitivity analyses. The more that we have control, the more we can reach the conclusion we thought we would get to. And I think it is a problem. I think it is.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. That age effect with cholesterol is something I've looked into a little bit too, and I find it interesting that certain papers talk about like survivorship bias, for example, for that, which I just like to point out. Almost nobody that discusses the high cholesterol relationship to age never mentions that.
I
But,
do.
Oh, you do? Yeah. I'm excluding you. I'm just saying in general on the social medias that I've seen. Yeah, but I agree overall. It's true. For the paper that I was talking about, it's pretty old. It's from 2003, I want to say, 2004, something along those lines. Yeah, I'd be happy to send it to you, of course. But there's a few other papers that are, I think, more recent. I haven't looked at those methods quite as much. There's one weakness of the paper that I discovered looking at, again, this is in individuals that have lower BMI, so they're normal BMI. And then they did these subgroup analyses to look at if they had diabetes or no diabetes, and then high blood pressure or no high blood pressure, and so on and so forth. The weakness of that is you're only looking at BMI, which is definitely lower than 25, but then you're relating that to no diabetes individually and then no high blood pressure individually, and so on and so forth. So it's not like you're combining these factors together to see if there's an effect. So there's definitely still room for, some other factor to be the case, but at least it brings us closer. I think it brings us closer to understanding that statin, through whatever mechanism, I think it's primarily at least ApoB, that it still provides a benefit for leaner individuals. Again, another thing that I find comical is on social media, we're hypercritical of the BMI standard.
Yeah.
But then, again, once we get to this point where we start having discussions of things that we like, we're like, yeah, BMI is okay, which honestly, I don't have a problem with BMI. I understand its limitations. Everybody should be aware of its limitations, but it's a fine metric for, a good proportion of the population. I'm not saying that for everyone. Absolutely.
Hypothesis building.
Yeah.
Right.
One could say.
Yeah. Look, I'm literally an author on BMI associated with the response of higher LDL on low carb.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's because that was the data that was available.
Right.
Of course, I would rather be going with actual.
Yeah, like lean mass and body fat
100%.
and all that. Yeah,
right.
of course.
So this is what, again, I feel like this should be the 101 out there, is to say, you know what, here's this data, here are the limitations on the data. I just don't like when somebody is like, here's literally the headline of this study, and it says this, and it's extremely categorical what the statement is that they make that it says, right?
But that happens all the time on
course it
social
does.
media.
Of course
That's why
it
I'm
does.
saying nuance is the word.
Yes. I have with Nick and Adrian, I've had several tweets where I say hashtag team nuance.
Nice.
So I'm
I
like
it.
really pressing for that.
Yeah, I like it.
And it's we need more things like this. I feel as though an interesting thing I've watched happen in real time is that there's a kind of anti-low carb consortium.
Oh, absolutely. I agree.
It's almost like, and to be fair, I think that's what happened to veganism, say 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
They're still being barraged, I think.
Yeah. And it's almost as if the latest and greatest diet of interest,
Yep.
take CGMs. I actually love this topic because I do think highly of CGMs. If you have a problem controlling your glucose, you may not even know it yet. Having a CGM on can be valuable for that.
Yeah. Okay.
It can also be valuable for other things that you're doing, But setting all of that aside, it seemed almost as if the same folks who were pressing on low carbers for like LDL, almost like overnight from many people in low carb world being interested in CGMs, it was like CGMs are terrible. You shouldn't actually be using CGM. And I found this so amusing because glucometers you can buy right now over the counter.
Yeah.
A CGM is basically just a regular
Just a continuous,
glucometer. So was there any problem with checking your blood multiple times a day from a glucometer?
No.
But the pushback was that there's some people in the low carb world who will pathogenize any rise in glucose, right? That's always bad at any degree. And okay, fair enough. But I think a lot of the knowledgeable sources in the low carb world wouldn't say that's always pathogenic. Any increase in glucose is bad, right? At least I hope not. It's whether or not it goes up and sustains up and that kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
But if somebody got interested in trying one out, even though there's some people would say it's only for diabetics, some number of those people would find out they're diabetic.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have known because it's now an oral glucose tolerance test that's automatically on.
Yeah.
So in that way, I hope we not only have more availability of CGMs, which we do now, it's over the counter, but more wearables. Eventually we're going to have like a watch that has it. And I'll bet a whole bunch of people are going to start discovering early on that they've got symptoms of, diabetes. So
Where do you think this like emotionality comes from in relation to, because you're right, because low carb has become pretty big over the last, I don't know, 5 years we'll say, but maybe more, maybe less. And now carnivore is kind of coming out of that even, and that's being attacked massively. Where do you think these emotions come from? And again, I could also definitely say the same for veganism or plant-based and whatnot. And it's actually a major reason, I've never actually said this publicly, but it's a major reason why I don't talk about my diet in general, because I've seen other people mention.
sorry I outed the pancakes.
It's actually my only fuel source.
The pancake diet.
Buy my book. No.
Yeah. It'd be a bestseller. I'm just telling you right now. You got it.
It might be, yeah. Start getting into the mechanisms and all that. Only focus on mechanisms.
Right.
Yeah, the issue is that people get so tribalistic about this stuff, and I don't mention what I eat because I've seen it in other creators and other science-based individuals. They'll say, like, just to help their audience, they'll be like, hey, here's what I eat in a day.
Right.
And people will for years afterwards just point to that one video and say, I don't listen to this guy because he eats this one food or eats like this. And I find that insane. I want to be known as I focus on the data. That's it. What I do doesn't matter. And I even have a video where I specifically called myself out in a way. I said, I am a hypocrite. And that's the title of the video, because I want people to know what I do is not always in line with the science, because I don't do this to be the most optimal in anything. I just love the science. I love nerding out, like with you, about the lipidology or vitamin D or anything, just because that is fascinating. Learning is my number one priority. Not I need to convince people they have to be on this style diet because that's what I consume. And I think that's where maybe the veganism idea, and if some vegans listen to this, they might crucify me, but that's where some of that, there's no diplomacy there. It's straight up, you're not doing what I'm doing, then screw you. I mean, and that's such a...
And actually, I think we can be fair to the vegans that they would argue that's because there actually is an ethical component to it. That's why it has to be categorical to them.
I agree.
Right. In the case of low carb, I actually am very interested in this topic. Or let me put it this way. I'm very, very fascinated by how much diet leads you to the science. In a lot of ways, people like the science that supports the diet that they already were inclined toward.
Yes.
Right? And a lot of times, countless times, I see people who are on a particular diet champion the diet, and whether or not they got tired of the diet, whether or not they really were dealing with issues and so forth, they have this kind of I'm I'm renouncing the diet or I'm modifying it. I found out that actually, I don't want to just eat meat. It turns out that there is good science to suggest I should be eating broccoli, which is now all I'm eating. I'm eating a lot of broccoli with my meat and so forth, right?
Right.
You don't, I honestly can't think of any influencer that I've seen, at least any that comes to mind, where they said, I know I've been speaking really highly of this diet and how healthy it is, but kind of been getting tired of eating only X and Y. And I kind of want to add Z. I just, I find I'm just happier adding this, and I actually don't think it's that healthy, right?
Yeah. Right.
And what I eat in a day, I don't do them because I don't trust that I actually would be accurate with it. I feel like many people, certainly if I were trying to be more upfront about what my diet is, I would feel the pressure of wanting it to be more of a pageant, like actually the best version of what I eat in a day. I'm not going to show one of my worst days where I'm not very proud of what I'm eating.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
But you're right, there's also this other problem, which is that when you're championing what you ate in a day, the people are looking to you as a guide for what they should be eating. They take it so personally
Yeah.
when you've changed your mind. But that's what almost everybody I know does. I know very few people who've been eating the same diet today that they were eating 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Almost nobody. It's so, as humans, we're very different. And yeah, there may be cuisine generalities depending on what region you came from.
Sure. Yeah.
But our tastes change a lot of times. And there may be good physiological reasons for that because we're chasing certain nutrients that we're not even aware become relevant. Who knows? All I know is that there really is, you put your finger on it, there really is this like tighter tribalism, I think, that comes from these nutrition categories.
Yeah. And yeah, so I'm curious, how do you specifically bridge that gap with COSI? Because I think what you're doing is, I mean, it's the best thing ever. There's no critiques. It's just you're doing the absolute best you possibly can. You're doing a wonderful job of it. But
Thank you.
it attracts. It seems to attract more of a low carb bent, which is understandable, right?
It's
Because
more of who follows me.
right, exactly, and people who are potentially LMHR, right? Because if they get on a ketogenic diet, they may experience some of the or all of the traits.
That, and it's the money we're raising for, right? So it's for a
Right.
research study on folks with high LDL.
Exactly. Yeah. So how do you bridge that gap? Because I know you have tried really hard to reach out to people that are kind of the mainstream lipidology, conventional. I'll call it conventional, just because mainstream. I hate. I sort of, not that I won't use it, but I don't like that term quite as much, just because people are starting to use it as an insult. Like you're part of the mainstream. You don't critically think. You're just one of those people, and it's just like the us versus them mentality. And I know that you've tried very hard to reach out, and I love the fact that Dr. What's his name? Bill. I'm like
Oh, Bill
blanking his name.
Cromwell.
Cromwell,
Yes.
right? Came last year, which was fantastic. I know you've reached out to several others for this year as well. So yeah, how do you bridge that gap? Because there is a strong bent one way, but what you're trying to do is bridge the gap as much as possible. And you're going to have people that just strongly, strongly disagree, including clinicians and scientists that might, present or just be there. And how do you entice people that have this kind of conventional style of thought to come and speak and debate and discuss and have this open dialogue?
It's, it's just a lot of working at it, making a very earnest effort. I think some number of folks like yourself they start with who is this guy? And they look things up, and you, in your opener for your podcast that I appeared on, or at least somewhere in the course of the podcast, you emphasized that you appreciated how much you could hear that I work very hard in my language.
Yes, I distinctly remember saying that.
It's not just a conscious effort. It's like an ever going, like I'm constantly second guessing the way that I say things, but I think in a good way, because I don't want to misstate something, not just for it to be clipped out of context or something like that, but because I really do think we're wired just naturally to be more dogmatic than we should be. I think we too easily make, sweeping statements.
I agree.
But some of my strongest opinions came from failing to defend a weaker opinion against them. So when I end up in a debate with somebody, very cordial debate, but where I'm like trying to press this point and the other person's just making too good of points against it, eventually I just have to shift gears and I have to go, okay, that's actually the better position. And eventually I have that position and I feel strongly about it because it was the winner in the challenge.
Okay, can I ask you like a deeper question related to that? Because I love that mentality, and that's what I try to foster as well. Maybe not always perfectly, but I try. But what about charisma? This is a major, let's call it a confounding factor
Yes.
for for getting to scientific truth, because the way that certain people speak, sometimes a lot of scientists, and I love I personally absolutely adored Dr. Cromwell's explanation at the last COSI. I watched the video with the panel and whatnot, but he's very data driven and he hedges his bets like a scientist. He's excellent at it as a scientist, but it doesn't come across, I don't think, to the audience. My intuition is that it doesn't come across to the audience because it's not necessarily charismatic, and people are drawn to charisma more than they are data. The best scenario is having a combination of both, but then it comes down to the individual to constantly check themselves. And like you said, you're constantly evolving. You're working at it nonstop. So people will make these convincing arguments based off charisma, but no strong data. And that's a really tough thing to bridge, because I think that a lot of scientists are not that great at speaking, or they're not that great at explaining difficult concepts to more understandable terms. And I think that's a disadvantage that ultimately favors people that are willing to just say almost whatever in a charismatic way.
So I think it's worth separating the two.
Okay.
So there's being data driven, there's being charismatic. Let's actually say, instead of saying data driven, let's say nuanced, because I think that's where you're going. Is somebody can be data driven, but it's not nuanced, right? It's like they chose one vector of data and they're going on the correlation versus causation, right? Okay, let me steel man like yours and Cromwell's position.
Okay.
for if I was coming at you to be like, yeah, low LDL causes earlier death, right? I could say that was data driven. I can show you the data. I can show you data that shows low LDL correlates with, earlier death. Therefore, low LDL causes death. That's data. I win, right?
I would argue that's not necessarily data driven. I mean, yes, like in the simplest technical sense, yes, but nuance and data driven, the way that I see people, are together.
Right. The nuance likely means you can acknowledge the data that I just mentioned, but now you need to explain what reverse causality is.
Sure.
That's going to take a moment, right?
Perfect. Yeah.
So while the bumper sticker version can sound attractive to a lot of people, even if it's in a non-charismatic way, even if I'm just like a jerk as I say it or something like that, then a lot of people are like, oh, that's what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear that.
Yeah.
And therefore I accept it. Just like a lot of people want to hear the reverse. They want to go, look, lower ApoB means no heart disease,
Yeah.
right? And so, well, I want to unpack that a little bit. And therefore, as I say something that's got a lot more, it's not that one's more charismatic than the other. Charismatic is, you like the sound of the person's voice, they present themselves well, they drop. It's true that I think the point you're getting to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the folks who are putting in the work to be as careful in how they say things and how they dictate them and how they unpack them and so forth, it's almost like, it's almost by default that it ends up coming off a bit drier than something that's shorter, more bumper sticker like, more categorical,
Yeah.
right? So the delivery of something that's more bumper sticker and maybe even a little snarky
Yeah, definitely.
just lands a little bit more with a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
But with that said, I think that there's just a natural maturing process with all of us.
Okay.
I think when you were young, certainly when I was young, almost all categories of things in my life, you could have extracted a bumper sticker answer from me as
1,000.
to how I took that thing.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
only after living in that category of life did I go, oh, okay, actually, there's a bit more to that, right? So in the early stages of nutrition, I was myself a bit more bumper sticker
Yeah.
because I was like, oh my God, this really does come down to carbs. So for a brief period of time, I wasn't just kind of into that sort of, wow, so many things come down to carbs, but I also had a little bit more vitriol. And this is where I'm going to come back to your original question with regard to, particularly with low carb.
Okay.
So you spent your whole life, certainly I'm one of these people, I've spent decades of my life hearing about the importance of bringing fat down. Fat is fattening, and being mindful of it. And feeling like all the carbs I had were not the problem. They're not going to fatten me up. And hearing one of my least favorite terms ever, which is empty calories. I'm mad that term even exists, but I relied on it.
Okay.
I relied on going, yeah, this isn't great. Doesn't have any nutrients, so it's like empty calories.
Okay.
Not empty, Dave.
Yeah.
Nope. that thing you were consuming was taking you closer to diabetes, right? And so what happens is you end up in this place where I got going to these forums, and they're not just saying lower your carbs. I'm responding back, but the Mayo Institute, the ADA, they're going, yeah, those guys are wrong. If you lower your carbs, your A1C is going to go down. And they were right. Okay, what does that do to me? I'm sure it's what happened to so many other people. They don't just find that this solution that wasn't from the ADA, that wasn't from the Mayo Institute, worked.
Yep.
Now they're upset.
Yeah.
They're upset that the people representing the convention, these jerks were hurting me. They were hurting my health, right? That's the sentiment.
Yeah.
And to be fair, they're not entirely wrong.
And I have no rebuttal against that. I completely agree.
I said this, I feel like I slipped because I don't normally talk about it publicly, but I have family members who are overly, in my opinion, they're overly comforted because their doctor appreciates how low their LDL is and effectively is giving them the impression that they're practically heart attack proof for how low their LDL is. It drives me crazy because they are not metabolically fit at all. I've said my piece. There's only so much I can do. But that sense that you're up against the system, I think, beyond dietary preferences, is why a lot of low carbers are in this position. And it is up to conventional medicine, conventional nutrition to adapt. I think that they do lose credibility, rightly so, when they don't. But low carb, I was feeling for a while like the ADA was heading in the right direction. They quietly agreed that low carb and keto could be an option.
Yeah.
And then I don't know what happened, but I know when it happened, and it was I think it was just before the summer last year.
Okay.
There was new material that came out, including this plate thing. I don't know if you saw that. It
No.
divided the plate into three. One half was non-starchy vegetables.
Okay.
1/4 was lean proteins. And then 1 other quarter was your favorite healthy carbs. And it, put up potatoes or rice or so forth.
Okay. Interesting.
And I had like an emotional reaction to that. I genuinely, when I saw this, because I know 2 of the family members follow the ADA,
Yeah.
because they're usually comforted by what the ADA is saying. There was that. There was a video that got released. The video that got released had a woman that was talking about it. And one of the things I really disliked was there were a lot of people in the low carb world that were both upset with the advice and were also very unkind about her appearance.
Okay.
By the way, I always hate that. I'm going to come out of the closet on this one because I usually don't criticize other people's behavior. That's a thing I try to be disciplined about. But I'll just say broadly, I don't love in the world of nutrition how much people choose to remark on somebody's appearance
Yeah.
or their health when individual health circumstances cannot be known. You
That's true.
don't know if there aren't other things related to their circumstances in life, divorce, diseases unrelated to their diet or anything. Anyway, sorry. That was a very tough time for me because sure enough, it did ultimately boil over in that I would see that picture on my phone of the plate, specifically showing the rice, because one of these family members really likes rice, but this person is very insulin resistant.
Yeah.
And it's different if you're not, but they are diabetic, and this is the organization around diabetes. So I sympathize, and I'll admit, this is where my bias is. I sympathize with where this passion comes from when it comes back to where a diet is efficacious. And where a diet, when somebody's going into the diet longevity component, it's like all over the place, right?
Yeah.
For people like you and me, we have more choices than most people.
Sure.
But if you have a problem with peanuts, if you have a peanut allergy, your diet, because of your circumstances, needs to not necessarily follow what some influencer on is saying about, oh, everyone can deal with peanuts. You're good. No, if you have a peanut allergy, you got to worry about that.
Yeah, and I think the peanut allergy is a great analogy. I mean, people need to see their own individual circumstance and understand that these institutions like the ADA and all the NIH, like whoever you're looking to for different advice on nutrition and whatnot, they're talking in generalities, and they do need to do a better job. One, let's talk about like low carb, for example. I don't really follow these organizations, not because I don't respect them, but just because I'm more interested in just looking at the primary literature. So I just don't worry about what they have to say that much. But one thing that they do need to do is, again, going back, I'm using the word arrogance. It could be something else. I don't know, but it's just, again, you have to bring the same energy for one type of nutrition as you do the other if there are truly the same level of benefit or greater level of benefit for both, right? For either one. So focusing on like a low fat nutrition and basically just saying this is what you need to be consuming is, I mean, at this point, we know pretty well there are a lot of studies on low carb, not saying necessarily ketogenic, although there are plenty of studies on ketogenic as well, but there are a good amount of studies on just low carb in general. And they show some pretty great benefits of a low carb diet. So to not champion that and say, wonderful news, we know that this diet can also be really useful. So maybe now, instead of saying you have to consume this low fat diet, you could try this other diet and just see if that works for you. And if it does, that's great. Here's some tips on how to make it a little bit healthier within the constraints of what that diet is. And that's the kind of, again, it's just the word nuance. I mean, here we're back
It's
at
the word
it.
nuance, and you're introducing the element of choice. Like I think the
Yes.
reason I had such a strong reaction was it was prescriptive.
Yeah.
So the fact that you're showing a plate and you're saying, here's what you should put on your plate, right? It's not just saying, like, I would prefer if the ADA said, look, depending on the severity of your diabetes, you will potentially benefit from having a lower and lower amount of carbs, right? Without even giving specific targets.
Right.
You can also lower your carbs effectively by just eating less, right? There's a statement Ben Bittman makes that I think is a legit statement, which is all weight loss diets are ultimately low insulin diets, right? So you could actually be on a high carb diet, so long as you have low basal insulin, 12 hours fasted, right? By the same token, if you're diabetic, I mean, granted, it depends on how many functional beta cells you have, but point being is that you just don't want to be in a state with which your glucose is out of control, dysregulated, whatever food you're eating. So whatever diet works for you, that just doesn't result in that. That's the diet. And I don't know what that diet is. I just don't want them to instruct people
Right.
to specifically add carbs, for which I think those people, if it was like 1/4 of their diet, would be problematic. And in these two family members I know, this is getting back to nuance. This is another challenge, is my dad is severely diabetic. I'm insulin resistant, but not nearly as bad as he is.
Yeah.
My sister is also insulin resistant, but not nearly as bad as I am. So the same 3 slices of bread are going to affect all 3 of us differently.
Yeah.
That part's already hard enough to deal with, chatting with family members about, because I may be being low carb and knowing where my range is, but I feel like a jerk if I'm next to my dad and he is like, well, you're eating that and you're trying to be low carb.
Yeah.
So it's tough. It's tough to work with that. I want to expand on the point that you're making with regard to the arrogance component,
Okay.
because I think you've touched on this many times before. Consistency. The big problem, I'm sure both you and I notice all the time, is I'm championing diet X, you're championing diet Y. I really love my correlative data. I love my epidemiology data that supports me,
Yeah.
right? Ooh, but yours is trash, right? I want to make a graphic that's like the real evidence pyramid, right? And it's got like my best data, my medium data, my worst data, your best data,
Yeah, right.
your medium data, right? Because
Exactly.
my anecdote, ad hoc case study, I don't care about your RCT double blind. No, this is so much better than your data.
Right.
That's how I feel like this space can get. What do you do?
Yeah, it's true. It's frustrating, and I really think that one massive portion is just understanding that what happens to you as an individual, all these studies, they're instructing you on the averages in the population, within the population. So that doesn't mean, like, you could be, again, all these studies have in statistics just each person is a data point. So they come back with a certain amount of information. One person has blood sugar of 110, another person has a blood sugar of 95, another one has 84, and it's kind of all over the place. There's spread. It's not, so that tells us that each individual is having a different reaction to whatever intervention you're talking about, if that's low carb or if you're low fat or high polyunsaturated fats, high saturated fats, whatever it is. And I just don't think people understand that. They just don't. I legitimately don't think that they understand that we're talking about averages. We're talking about a widespread. This is what the study indicates, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to have as strong of an effect if you follow what this study does, or you might not even have that effect at all, because you may be the extraneous variable or extraneous data point that they may have cut out because it was 6-fold higher than which is a whole nother
I hate that
conversation.
too.
I
I'm sure
know.
you know that. I only found out about that recently. Not by recently. I mean, like 3-4 years ago. That it's actually fairly common to chop off the outliers on either end of
Yeah.
a range of data, that's like it's super common. And the data geek in me is like, whoa, that could have been like some of the most important data to catch.
Yeah. And there's different schools of thought on that. We won't get into that for the time being. But the point being that when a person runs across a study where they've had a completely different experience of what the study indicates, that does not mean that your experience is invalid. It just means that you may not have fit that sample. Like you may be normal weight and the study was in overweight individuals, or they may be in diabetic individuals and you're just pre-diabetic. Like there's all kinds of different variables, and that nuance again is just something I wish people would understand, that the studies are just giving you general ideas, and so are these institutions. They're giving us general ideas. They need to do a better job. I completely understand. I completely agree, but we just shouldn't get so mad at, well, there has to be a problem with that study. It's like, no, the study just says what it says. And we need to learn how to speak about the study.
Right.
And that's where social media is really bad, really bad. That's where I appreciate your content and Nick's content. And if I can plug a few others, like Gil from Nutrition Made Simple,
I watch a lot of his videos.
he is a rock star. I know some people will strongly disagree with me. I really love his work.
I want to get him here. Actually, he's mindful of his carbon footprint, which is why he doesn't want to travel too much.
Yeah.
Which I credit him for. He walks his talk.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe I'll have to swing by Portugal someday and drop in. Real quick, you and him and who's the other? I saw a graphic recently of the three of you.
Dr. Stanfield, I think.
Right. You guys are doing some collaborative something?
Yeah, we might do something, nothing like huge or anything like that, but every once in a while. So Gil wants to do a kind of like an AMA where we don't know each other's answers. We would come together, it's just over like Zoom, and then he would just ask the question. We don't know the question, but we have some background in the question, and then we just each give our answers on that. So we'll pre-write the answers so we have some idea what we're going to say before, and then just so people can understand that we might have different takes on it, maybe slightly different takes, or maybe big takes, and then we'll discuss it together and just try to come to some understanding on how to be more actionable on, okay, now that we have three slightly different takes, or maybe two takes that are the same and one that's vehemently completely opposite, how do we come to some sort of understanding, and how do we take away, some information from that? It's just a cool idea that Gil had.
Yeah, I would watch it. I think it'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it would be much more difficult with individuals that vehemently disagree with one another, which I don't think that we do.
You don't. You guys actually have a lot in common.
Yeah.
But I hope you'll help me in this area, because getting back to what you were talking about with COSI,
Yeah.
that's arguably the one of the largest goals I have. Is I'm trying to get more productive discussion between differing opinions. What I liked about COSI is it's actually getting people literally physically in the same space.
Yep.
And believe it or not, we would have had, or maybe you already know this, we would have had three people who are generally pro LDL lowering. There's yourself and there's Chris McCaskill. We had Tom Rafai originally. Yeah. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it due to a travel issue. But Chris McCaskill, big plug to him. He tried to help me get. We actually invited Gil. Gil was one of the people. That's why I know he wouldn't travel for that reason.
Oh, too bad.
But I was excited for the prospect of the three of you actually being at our conference. So it would have been amazing.
Yeah, it would have
and
been fun.
Mario was the next person we went to.
Yeah, I just did a podcast with him maybe 2 weeks ago.
He's great.
He's fantastic. That's another wonderful source. Nourished by Science.
Right.
He's really fantastic. I think he's an example of a person who acknowledges low carb diets work. They can work perfectly healthy. But he's got a background in nutrition, like clinical, not clinical, as in doing clinical trials. doing research in that field, and he's got a ton of experience in insulin resistance specifically. So I'm hoping to interview him at some point just to have that
I
discussion.
want to get him here.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. So bridging that gap, I'm with you completely.
well, I feel like I feel like a pleasant side effect about when you get a conversation like this going on is that the audience sees, like just naturally as a side effect, they see how much overlap there is between two sides who might have very different opinions, because the different opinions get isolated out too easily on social media.
I agree. Yep.
You tend to only see these extremes and feel like there's these extremes. And in reality, there's really so much we have in common often that even when actively debating becomes like readily apparent
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
you quickly concede things that somebody else is saying. A lot of times what they agree on is pretty interesting in a way that you weren't ready for.
Yeah. Like on the panel discussion, for example, the one common theme was lifestyle intervention should come first and foremost above anything for
Yeah.
improving your health. I mean, that shouldn't be that revolutionary. And I mean, we all definitely agree on that. At COSA, I can safely say there are a good 5 or 6 people I vehemently disagree with. But, you know, just have a conversation. Maybe we'll continue to disagree. That's fine. But at least the point being just bringing these people together so that people can hear different perspectives and so that they can hear these people have these nuanced conversations. I just keep saying the word. I know it gets overly
It's the right
repetitive, but you know, we can't have, to your point, we can't have these echo chambers of a person just saying, well, they believe this horrible idea. And then that person from, let's say, from that camp, quote unquote camp, comes and speaks. And then people are like, well, okay, well, that actually was pretty reasonable. That wasn't so inflammatory and whatnot. I told Chris this, Chris McCaskill, that I overheard some people saying that their favorite talk was his. And I was
Nice.
like, that is so cool. I mean, that's
I
really cool.
and I love that. Like it's this is what I think. I think if you have an event like COSI, and it's a lot because we really do it on a shoestring budget and skeleton crew. Once again, gotta
And it
say,
was awesome. It
yeah,
was awesome.
but it really is a legit fundraising operation.
Yeah.
We're not we're so serious about trying to keep the cost so low to make it happen, right?
Yeah. Right.
But it is my larger dream that if we are going to do something like that, we do get a lot of different people in the same room. I think many of the people who are my friends, who are on the low carb side but are superstars, I believe that they appreciate it because I tell them this in advance. So, for example, I for some folks who I thought might have an objection, I let them know the full slate of the speakers coming, right? And to everyone's credit, they were like, well, no, this is what you've always been wanting the conference to be, and it didn't change their travel plans. And that's meaningful to me because basically, to answer your larger question, I think it really just is a lot of show by example.
Yeah.
It's just easier to fall into the echo chamber. It's not just that it's more comfortable. It's that it's less effort. If you're just willing to put in the effort, if you're just willing to just make it happen, not only do more people agree, but I think there's a snowball effect. My hope is this podcast, I can get a lot of people who disagree with me here so that we can just have a good conversation.
I genuinely hope that that turns out to be the case. I think some people are incredibly amenable to it. It needs to become a norm, and you are a trendsetter in that regard. I mean, you're not just talking about it, you're actually walking the talk, which is I don't have the energy for it. I legitimately just don't have the energy for it. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy for it. Not that, I always try to respectfully disagree with people. I never like attack their person or anything like that. But to bring all these people together into one place and to have these like debates and these presentations and whatnot, that's so much energy and I mean, like you said, a shoestring budget. But the way it was put together, it looked so professional, and everybody got along, and it was just this, it was a great experience.
So I've definitely taken up a bit of your time, but was there anything else you wanted to cover?
No, nothing really jumps to mind. Yeah, I'm. It's for me, physiology. I could talk about that for days and days and days and all kinds of different directions. So,
How about you just come back again?
yeah, I would love that.
We'll have like a new checklist, and
Okay, yeah, no, that'd be great.
I'm glad we hit a bunch of the stuff that we didn't cover in our prior conversation with each other.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
example, and talking about the study a bit more and so forth. But I liked also getting into, because it's a pet subject of mine too, the tribalism and how best to navigate science. I feel like we really got into a lot of the scientific philosophy stuff, which is great.
Yeah, we did, and discussing a little bit on the statistics and whatnot. And there's plenty more to say, but it's a lot of it. You're just not going to learn everything in one podcast. I mean, no matter how long it runs, especially with us, it's going to run.
It's true.
It's going to run for hours.
I mean, I was only being mindful because there are other things I'm supposed to do at some point today, but we've gone for a good clip here.
Okay.
I will leave you with one last question, which I'm going to be asking just about everyone, and I had it throughout when I was first filming the documentary. But what is your prediction for the longitudinal data results? Do you think it'll show a rapid progression of atherosclerosis for the lean mass hyperresponder cohort?
This is the one comparing against.
Not the match, but the actual original endpoint, comparing first set of scans to second set of scans. Not just a modest increase, but will there be a rapid increase comparable to a high-risk population?
No, I firmly hypothesize no.
Okay. So, in spite of how high their LDL is, you're at least conceding that you're of the mind that their metabolic health and not having the other cardiovascular risk factors is highly relevant as to their likely progression of plaque.
Yeah, highly relevant. Yeah, absolutely. Metabolic health is a huge player. No doubt about it. I would hope nobody would disagree with that.
Yeah. Well,
I know some people would, but I would hope.
Well, hopefully these data will tell us either way.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm excited.
Won't know until it's in front of us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.